Bienvenidos. Soy el contador de historias y hoy vengo a ayudarles. Sé que utilizan estos videos para relajarse y dormir, así que antes de hacerlo, suscríbanse al canal y dejen su like. También cuéntenme qué hora es y desde dónde nos están viendo. Ahora, relájense y déjense llevar.
La primera noche que pasamos en la casa, desperté con la certeza absoluta de que alguien me observaba. No fue un presentimiento vago ni el residuo de algún sueño olvidado. Fue una convicción física, como el peso de una mano invisible sobre el pecho, como el tacto húmedo de un aliento ajeno rozándome la nuca. Mi esposa dormía a mi lado, su respiración acompasada contra la almohada, ajena a esa presencia que yo sentía con cada fibra de mi cuerpo. Miré el reloj en la mesita de noche. Las 3:14. La casa crujía a nuestro alrededor con ese lenguaje secreto que tienen las construcciones antiguas, ese vocabulario de maderas que se contraen y tuberías que suspiran, y traté de convencerme de que solo era eso. Una casa desconocida, sonidos nuevos, la ansiedad natural de quien duerme por primera vez en un lugar extraño. Pero algo estaba mal, algo que no podía nombrar. Habíamos comprado la propiedad 3 meses antes, atraídos por su precio absurdamente bajo y por esa fachada de piedra gris que parecía sacada de otra época. El agente inmobiliario nos había mostrado cada habitación con un entusiasmo excesivo, hablando sin parar sobre los techos altos y los pisos de roble original, sobre la chimenea de mármol y el jardín trasero que solo necesitaba algo de cariño. Nunca mencionó al anterior propietario. Cuando pregunté por qué la casa llevaba tanto tiempo en el mercado, cambió de tema con una habilidad que entonces me pareció profesional y ahora reconozco como evasiva. La encontramos perfecta. Mi esposa se enamoró de la escalera de madera oscura que descendía en una curva elegante hacia el vestíbulo, de los ventanales emplomados que filtraban la luz en fragmentos de colores, de ese olor a tiempo y a secretos que impregnaba cada rincón. Firmamos los papeles esa misma semana. Durante las primeras jornadas de mudanza, noté ciertos detalles que atribuía al descuido de los anteriores habitantes. Marcas de arañazos en el marco de una puerta, como si alguien hubiera intentado abrirla con las uñas. Un rectángulo más claro en el empapelado del pasillo, el fantasma de un cuadro que había colgado allí durante décadas. Y en la sala principal, frente a la chimenea, las 4 hendiduras profundas en la alfombra, donde había descansado una silla pesada durante tanto tiempo que la tela había quedado permanentemente deformada. Mi esposa sugirió que pusiéramos nuestro propio sillón en ese lugar, pero algo en mí se resistió. Coloqué una mesa auxiliar sobre esas marcas, como si cubrirlas pudiera borrar lo que significaban. La segunda noche, bajé a la cocina por un vaso de agua. Eran casi las 3 de la madrugada y la casa estaba sumida en esa oscuridad particular de las horas sin luna, una negrura tan densa que parecía tener textura. Encendí la linterna de mi teléfono y caminé por el pasillo, sintiendo el frío del piso de madera atravesarme las plantas de los pies. Al pasar junto a la escalera, algo me hizo detenerme, un olor, tenue pero inconfundible, tabaco de pipa y algo más. Algo dulzón y ligeramente pútrido que no pude identificar. Duró apenas un instante, luego desapareció, reemplazado por el aroma neutro del polvo y la madera vieja. En la cocina, mientras llenaba el vaso, escuché un crujido proveniente de la sala. No el crujido aleatorio de una casa que se asienta, sino el sonido específico y reconocible de alguien sentándose en una silla. Un peso acomodándose. Un cuerpo ocupando un espacio. Me quedé inmóvil, el agua desbordando el vaso y mojándome los dedos. Esperé. El silencio que siguió fue peor que cualquier sonido, un silencio con peso, con intención, un silencio que escuchaba. No fui a la sala esa noche, subí las escaleras sin mirar atrás, sintiendo en cada peldaño la certeza de que algo me observaba desde abajo. Mi esposa notó mi insomnio creciente. Me preguntó si todo estaba bien, si la mudanza me estaba afectando, si extrañaba nuestro apartamento anterior. Le dije que solo necesitaba tiempo para adaptarme. No le conté sobre los ruidos. No le conté sobre el olor. No le conté que cada noche, exactamente a las 3, me despertaba con la sensación de que la casa contenía algo más que nosotros dos. Una semana después, finalmente lo vi. Había bajado al baño del primer piso porque la tubería del nuestro estaba haciendo un ruido extraño. Al volver hacia las escaleras, la luz de la luna se filtraba por uno de los ventanales y proyectaba un rectángulo pálido sobre el piso del vestíbulo. Desde mi posición podía ver parte de la sala a través del arco que conectaba ambos espacios. Y allí, exactamente donde la mesa auxiliar cubría las marcas en la alfombra, pero a un lado de ella, como si la mesa no existiera, había una silla. Una silla que no estaba allí cuando bajé. Y en la silla había un hombre. Estaba sentado muy erguido, con las manos sobre los reposabrazos, mirando directamente hacia el pie de la escalera, hacia donde yo estaba. Su rostro quedaba en sombras, pero pude distinguir la silueta de un traje oscuro, el brillo apagado de un reloj de bolsillo, el contorno de un cabello peinado hacia atrás. No se movía, no respiraba, simplemente estaba allí, tan inmóvil como un mueble, tan presente como las paredes. El terror que sentí fue diferente a cualquier miedo que hubiera experimentado antes. No fue el sobresalto de una película de horror ni la adrenalina de un susto repentino. Fue algo más profundo, más antiguo, un terror que parecía venir de algún lugar primitivo de mi cerebro, de esa parte que nuestros ancestros usaban para detectar depredadores en la oscuridad de las cavernas. Cada célula de mi cuerpo gritaba que corriera, pero mis piernas se negaban a moverse. No sé cuánto tiempo permanecí allí, congelado en el primer escalón, mirando esa figura que me miraba a mí. Podrían haber sido segundos o podrían haber sido horas. En algún momento, parpadeé. Cuando abrí los ojos, la silla ya no estaba. El espacio frente a la chimenea estaba vacío excepto por la mesa auxiliar y las marcas en la alfombra. La luna seguía brillando. La casa seguía en silencio, y yo seguía allí, temblando, con el corazón latiendo tan fuerte que podía sentirlo en las sienes. Convencí a mi esposa de que visitáramos a los vecinos. Necesitaba saber quién había vivido en esa casa antes que nosotros. Necesitaba confirmar que no estaba perdiendo la razón. El vecino de la izquierda era un hombre mayor de expresión cansada y manos temblorosas. Cuando mencioné la casa, algo cambió en su rostro. Un endurecimiento sutil, una sombra que le cruzó los ojos. Me dijo que el anterior propietario había vivido allí durante 47 años, solo, sin familia, sin visitas. Un hombre reservado que salía únicamente para comprar provisiones y tabaco para su pipa. Falleció en la propiedad, aunque el vecino no supo decirme exactamente cómo ni cuándo. Lo único que recordaba con claridad era haberlo visto a veces de noche, sentado en una silla junto a la ventana de la sala, mirando hacia afuera con esa inmovilidad particular de los muy ancianos o los muy enfermos. Le pregunté si alguna vez había notado algo extraño en la casa después de que el hombre muriera. El vecino me miró de una manera que no pude descifrar, una mezcla de lástima y algo más, algo parecido al miedo. Me dijo que los anteriores compradores, una pareja que vivió allí solo 3 meses antes de que la casa volviera al mercado, le habían hecho exactamente la misma pregunta. No conseguí más información. El vecino se excusó diciendo que tenía cosas que hacer y cerró la puerta con una prisa que contradecía su fragilidad aparente. Esa noche decidí no dormir. Me senté en nuestra habitación con todas las luces encendidas, mirando el reloj, esperando las 3 de la madrugada. Mi esposa se durmió temprano, agotada por el trabajo de organizar la casa. La observé un momento, tan ajena a todo, tan protegida por su ignorancia, y sentí una envidia amarga. A las 2:58, la luz de la habitación parpadeó. A las 2:59, un frío repentino se instaló en el aire, un frío que no tenía que ver con la temperatura, sino con algo más, con una presencia, con un desplazamiento. A las 3, escuché el crujido de la silla. Bajé las escaleras con el teléfono en la mano, grabando. Necesitaba evidencia. Necesitaba pruebas de que no estaba enloqueciendo. El olor a tabaco y a algo dulzón me golpeó a mitad de camino, tan intenso que me provocó náuseas. Cuando llegué al último escalón, lo vi. Estaba exactamente igual que la vez anterior, sentado, erguido, mirándome. Pero esta vez pude ver más detalles. La piel de sus manos, demasiado pálida, casi gris. El corte anticuado de su traje y sus ojos, que ahora la luz de mi teléfono alcanzaba parcialmente. Unos ojos que no reflejaban nada, como si estuvieran hechos de una sustancia que absorbía la luz en lugar de devolverla. Me obligué a sostenerle la mirada, a no huir. Entonces, lentamente, con una deliberación que me heló la sangre, el hombre inclinó la cabeza. Un gesto mínimo, casi imperceptible. Un saludo, un reconocimiento. Subí corriendo las escaleras. Cuando revisé la grabación, el video mostraba solo la sala vacía, la mesa auxiliar, las marcas en la alfombra, ninguna silla, ningún hombre. Solo yo, respirando agitadamente, apuntando la cámara hacia la nada. Las semanas siguientes fueron un descenso lento hacia algo que no sé cómo nombrar. Cada noche, a las 3, despertaba. Cada noche sentía su presencia abajo, esperándome. Cada noche esa presencia parecía más intensa, más cercana, como si estuviera subiendo gradualmente la escalera, un peldaño por noche. Mi esposa empezó a preocuparse. Me decía que hablaba dormido, que repetía las mismas palabras una y otra vez, aunque no podía entender cuáles. Me decía que mis ojos tenían un aspecto diferente, algo que no sabía describir pero que la inquietaba. Me sugirió que viera a un profesional. Quizás el estrés, quizás la falta de sueño, quizás estaba procesando algo que no me permitía admitir. No le conté nada. ¿Cómo podía explicarle que cada mañana, cuando bajaba a la sala, las marcas en la alfombra parecían más profundas? ¿Que a veces encontraba ceniza de tabaco en lugares donde no debería haber ceniza? ¿Que el espejo del vestíbulo a veces me devolvía un reflejo que tardaba una fracción de segundo en moverse cuando yo me movía? Empecé a evitar la planta baja después del anochecer. Empecé a dormir con la luz encendida. Empecé a contar los escalones cada vez que bajaba, porque una mañana conté uno más de los que debía haber. Una noche no pude resistir más. Bajé a las 3 en punto y me senté en el sofá, frente al espacio donde él aparecía. Esperé. El frío llegó primero, luego el olor, luego ese crujido particular de la silla que no existía. Y allí estaba él, mirándome, pero algo era diferente. Estaba más cerca, mucho más cerca. Ya no junto a la chimenea, sino a mitad de la sala, como si la distancia entre nosotros se hubiera reducido mientras yo no prestaba atención. Y su rostro, que antes permanecía en sombras, ahora era casi distinguible. Vi una nariz aguileña, una boca fina, sin expresión, y esos ojos vacíos que parecían mirar no hacia mí, sino a través de mí, hacia algo que yo no podía ver. Le pregunté qué quería. Mi voz sonó extraña en el silencio de la casa, como si las palabras fueran absorbidas por las paredes antes de completarse. El hombre no respondió, simplemente alzó una mano, muy lentamente, y señaló hacia la escalera, hacia el lugar donde mi esposa estaría bajando cualquiera de estas noches, atraída por mis ausencias, por mi comportamiento errático, hacia el lugar donde alguien siempre baja, eventualmente. Comprendí entonces algo que debería haber comprendido desde el principio. Él no me estaba amenazando, no me estaba persiguiendo. Él simplemente esperaba, como había esperado al anterior propietario, como había esperado a los compradores que huyeron después de 3 meses, como esperaría a quien viniera después de nosotros. Algunos lugares no pertenecen a los vivos. Algunos lugares solo prestan el espacio mientras deciden quién se quedará a ocupar la silla. Escribo esto en nuestra habitación, con la luz encendida, mientras mi esposa duerme a mi lado. Son las 2:47 de la madrugada. En 13 minutos, la casa despertará. En 13 minutos, él estará abajo, esperando. Lo peor no es que lo vea. Lo peor es que últimamente, cuando me miro al espejo, noto que mis ojos están empezando a reflejar cada vez menos luz. Lo peor es que ayer, sin darme cuenta, me senté en la sala durante horas, mirando fijamente la escalera. Lo peor es que esta noche, por primera vez, no siento miedo de bajar. Siento algo parecido a un regreso. Historia 2. El espejo llegó un martes de octubre.
envuelto en mantas que olían a naftalina y a ese perfume de lavanda que mi abuela usaba hasta el día de su funeral. Mi esposa lo recibió con una mezcla de fascinación y recelo mientras los hombres de la mudanza lo apoyaban contra la pared del pasillo, jadeando por el esfuerzo. El marco victoriano, tallado con rostros de querubines cuyos ojos parecían seguirme desde cualquier ángulo, pesaba más de lo que aparentaba, mucho más. Esa primera noche lo instalamos en el dormitorio, frente a la cama. Mi esposa insistió en que era el lugar perfecto, que la luz de la mañana realzaría las volutas doradas del marco. Yo no discutí. Nunca discutía con ella sobre decoración, aunque algo en mi estómago se contrajo cuando vi mi reflejo por primera vez en aquella superficie de mercurio antiguo. La imagen tenía una cualidad diferente, como si el cristal absorbiera la luz en lugar de devolverla. Mi rostro se veía más pálido, las sombras bajo mis ojos más pronunciadas, mis facciones sutilmente distorsionadas de una manera que no podía precisar. Los primeros días fueron normales, o eso quise creer. Fue durante la segunda semana cuando noté la primera anomalía. Me estaba afeitando en el baño cuando escuché un ruido en el dormitorio. Al asomarme, vi mi reflejo en el espejo victoriano. Estaba quieto, mirándome, pero yo había girado la cabeza hacia la izquierda y el reflejo, estoy seguro de esto, tardó un instante imperceptible en seguir el movimiento. Una fracción de segundo, quizás menos. Lo suficiente para que un escalofrío me recorriera la columna vertebral. Me acerqué al espejo con cautela, como quien se aproxima a un animal salvaje que finge dormir. Mi reflejo me devolvió la mirada con perfecta sincronía. Levanté la mano derecha. El reflejo levantó la izquierda, como debe ser. Parpadeé. Él parpadeó. Todo normal. Todo perfectamente, inquietantemente normal. Le mencioné el incidente a mi esposa durante el desayuno. Ella se rió con esa risa suya que siempre me había parecido encantadora, pero que esa mañana sonó hueca, como el eco de algo que se arrastra por un pasillo vacío. Me dijo que estaba trabajando demasiado, que necesitaba dormir más. Tenía razón, probablemente. Llevaba semanas con insomnio, despertando a las 3 de la madrugada con la sensación de que alguien me observaba desde algún rincón oscuro de la habitación. Pero los desfases continuaron. Cada vez eran más evidentes, más prolongados. Una tarde, mientras me cambiaba de ropa, vi que mi reflejo comenzaba a desabotonarse la camisa antes de que mis dedos tocaran el primer botón. Me quedé paralizado, con las manos suspendidas en el aire, y observé cómo la imagen en el espejo completaba el gesto que yo aún no había iniciado. Cuando finalmente moví mis manos, el reflejo ya había terminado. Me miraba con una expresión que no reconocí como mía, algo entre la satisfacción y la burla, un pliegue en la comisura de los labios que yo jamás había hecho. El aire del dormitorio se volvió denso, cargado de un olor metálico que me recordaba a la sangre vieja. La temperatura descendió varios grados en cuestión de segundos. Pude ver mi aliento condensándose frente a mi rostro, pero en el espejo, mi reflejo no exhalaba vapor alguno. Empecé a evitar el dormitorio. Inventaba excusas para quedarme despierto en el estudio hasta altas horas de la noche. Leía los mismos párrafos una y otra vez sin retener nada, con el oído atento a cualquier sonido proveniente del piso superior. A veces escuchaba crujidos, ese gemido característico de la madera antigua que podría ser la casa asentándose o podría ser pasos. Pasos que iban del dormitorio al pasillo y se detenían justo antes de las escaleras, como si algo o alguien estuviera considerando si bajar o no. Mi esposa comenzó a mirarme de manera extraña. Me preguntaba si me sentía bien, si había algo que quisiera contarle. Yo negaba con la cabeza, incapaz de articular lo que estaba experimentando sin sonar completamente demente. ¿Cómo explicar que mi propio reflejo se había convertido en algo ajeno, algo que anticipaba mis movimientos como si conociera mis intenciones antes que yo mismo? Una noche, cedí al agotamiento y me acosté temprano. Mi esposa ya dormía, su respiración pausada y regular como un metrónomo. La habitación estaba sumida en una penumbra azulada, iluminada apenas por la luz de la calle que se filtraba entre las cortinas. Y allí estaba el espejo, su superficie brillando con un resplandor tenue que no correspondía a ninguna fuente de luz visible. Me incorporé sobre un codo y miré hacia el cristal. Mi reflejo estaba sentado en la cama, igual que yo.
pero su postura era diferente. Mientras yo me apoyaba sobre el codo izquierdo, él usaba el derecho, y no me miraba a mí, miraba a mi esposa dormida, con una intensidad que me heló la sangre. La expresión de su rostro, de mi rostro, era de una avidez hambrienta, de una fascinación oscura que me provocó náuseas. Cerré los ojos con fuerza, contando hasta 10, convenciéndome de que era una pesadilla, un truco de la luz, una manifestación de mi estrés acumulado. Cuando los abrí, el reflejo había vuelto a la normalidad. Me miraba a mí, solo a mí, con ojos que eran míos, pero que parecían contener algo más en sus profundidades, algo antiguo y paciente que había estado esperando durante mucho tiempo. Al día siguiente, busqué información sobre el espejo, revisé las cajas que habían llegado junto con él, llenas de papeles amarillentos y fotografías descoloridas de la casa de mi abuela. Encontré un diario de cuero negro, sus páginas manchadas de humedad y tiempo. La letra era difícil de descifrar, pero algunas frases saltaban del papel como advertencias. El espejo muestra lo que seremos, decía una entrada fechada en 1956. No mires demasiado tiempo o él te verá a ti, advertía otra de 1962. Las últimas páginas estaban arrancadas, dejando solo jirones de papel como cicatrices. Quise deshacerme del espejo. Lo propuse esa misma noche, con una calma que no sentía, argumentando que no combinaba con la decoración moderna de nuestra casa. Mi esposa me miró con una expresión que no supe interpretar. Me dijo que el espejo era una herencia familiar, un recuerdo de mi abuela, que sería una falta de respeto venderlo o regalarlo tan pronto. Su voz tenía un filo que nunca antes había notado, una firmeza que no admitía réplica. Esa noche, por primera vez, el reflejo dejó de imitarme por completo. Estaba parado frente al espejo, preparándome para dormir, cuando noté que la imagen no se movía. Yo levanté los brazos. El reflejo permaneció inmóvil, con los brazos a los costados. Yo incliné la cabeza. Él continuó mirándome fijamente, sin parpadear. Di un paso hacia atrás, y entonces el reflejo sonrió. Una sonrisa amplia, desagradable, que deformaba mis facciones en algo grotesco, y comenzó a caminar hacia el cristal. Cada paso que daba el reflejo producía un eco sordo, como si golpeara la superficie del espejo desde dentro. El cristal comenzó a ondularse, a curvarse hacia afuera, como si algo presionara desde el otro lado. El olor a lavanda de mi abuela inundó la habitación, mezclado con algo más, un hedor a tierra húmeda, a hojas podridas, a cosas que se descomponen en la oscuridad. No pude moverme. Mis piernas se negaban a responder, ancladas al suelo por un terror primitivo que paralizaba cada músculo de mi cuerpo. El reflejo. Esa cosa que ya no era yo presionó una mano contra el cristal y vi cómo la superficie cedía bajo su palma, estirándose como una membrana a punto de romperse. Entonces mi esposa gritó mi nombre. El hechizo se rompió. Giré hacia ella, que se había incorporado en la cama con los ojos muy abiertos, mirando hacia el espejo. Cuando volví la vista, mi reflejo había regresado a su lugar, imitando mi postura con perfecta precisión, como si nada hubiera ocurrido. El cristal estaba liso, impecable, sin rastro de la deformación que había presenciado. Ella me preguntó qué hacía parado frente al espejo a oscuras. ¿Por qué la había despertado susurrando palabras que no pudo entender? Yo no recordaba haber hablado, no recordaba cuánto tiempo había estado allí, mirando. Los números del reloj indicaban las 4 de la madrugada, pero yo me había levantado de la cama apenas pasada la medianoche. 4 horas desaparecidas, borradas de mi memoria como tinta diluida en agua. Desde esa noche, evito los espejos. Todos los espejos. Me afeito en la ducha, a ciegas, cortándome con frecuencia. Cubro las superficies reflectantes de la casa con telas oscuras. Mi esposa ha dejado de preguntar. Ahora solo me observa con una mezcla de lástima y algo más que no quiero nombrar. A veces la sorprendo mirando el espejo victoriano durante largos minutos, con una sonrisa ausente en los labios, moviendo la mano en pequeños gestos que su reflejo parece anticipar. O quizás sea al revés. Ya no estoy seguro de nada. No estoy seguro de si el espejo muestra el futuro o si lo crea. No estoy seguro de si lo que vi fue real o si mi mente, deteriorada por el insomnio y la tensión, fabricó una pesadilla tangible para explicar miedos más profundos. A veces pienso que el reflejo no era una entidad separada, sino una versión de mí mismo que aún no existe, una posibilidad latente que el espejo simplemente revela. Anoche encontré el diario de mi abuela abierto sobre mi escritorio, en una página que no había visto antes. La tinta era fresca, brillante, como si alguien acabara de escribir esas palabras. Cuando el reflejo deja de seguirte, significa que ya eres tú quien lo sigue a él. No recuerdo haber abierto el diario, no recuerdo haberme sentado en el escritorio, pero mis dedos estaban manchados de tinta negra, y en el espejo del estudio, el pequeño espejo que olvidé cubrir mi reflejo sostenía una pluma y sonreía. Escribo esto ahora, en la quietud de la madrugada, mientras mi esposa duerme en la habitación de arriba. El espejo victoriano está allí, esperando. Puedo sentirlo, como se siente el peso de una mirada en la nuca, como se percibe la presencia de alguien que respira en la oscuridad, aunque no puedas verlo. Me pregunto qué mostrará mañana. Me pregunto si mañana seré yo quien se refleje en ese cristal, o si la cosa que me observa desde el otro lado finalmente habrá encontrado la forma de cruzar. Me pregunto, con un terror frío y racional que es peor que cualquier pánico, si no habrá cruzado ya hace mucho tiempo, y si el que escribe estas palabras es realmente quien cree ser. El reloj marca las 3 de la madrugada. En algún lugar de la casa escucho el crujido de la madera vieja, pasos que bajan las escaleras, pasos que se acercan a la puerta del estudio, y en el pequeño espejo que olvidé cubrir, veo mi reflejo levantarse de la silla antes de que yo decida moverme. Historia 3. La primera vez que desperté hablando solo, lo atribuí al estrés del divorcio. Llevaba 3 meses viviendo en aquel departamento del 5º piso, un espacio reducido con paredes amarillentas y tuberías que gemían cada vez que algún vecino abría una llave de agua. El edificio tenía más de 60 años y olía a humedad antigua, a polvo acumulado en rincones que ninguna escoba había tocado en décadas. Fue mi vecina de abajo quien me lo mencionó primero. Me cruzó en el pasillo una mañana de martes, mientras yo bajaba las escaleras con la mirada perdida en el celular. Era una mujer de unos 70 años, con el cabello recogido en un moño apretado y ojos que parecían examinar todo, con una mezcla de curiosidad y desconfianza. Me detuvo con un gesto de la mano y me preguntó si tenía visitas por las noches. Le dije que no, que vivía solo. Ella frunció los labios y asintió lentamente, como si mi respuesta confirmara algo que ya sospechaba. Me explicó que había escuchado conversaciones, no discusiones, aclaró, sino charlas tranquilas, casi amables, mi voz y otra. Una voz que ella no lograba distinguir bien, como si viniera de muy lejos o a través de algo denso. Le aseguré que debía ser el televisor, aunque sabía que no lo encendía desde hacía semanas. Ella no pareció convencida. Antes de alejarse, murmuró algo sobre el inquilino anterior, pero no alcancé a entender sus palabras. Esa noche comencé a prestar atención. El departamento tenía una distribución extraña. La habitación principal daba directamente a un pequeño recibidor sin ventanas, y desde la cama podía ver el rincón junto al armario empotrado, un espacio donde la luz de la lámpara de noche nunca llegaba completamente. Siempre había algo incómodo en ese ángulo, una oscuridad que parecía más densa de lo normal, como si el aire mismo se espesara allí. Me dormí observándolo, con una inquietud difusa instalada en el pecho. Desperté a las 3 de la madrugada con la garganta seca y la certeza absoluta de que acababa de pronunciar una frase. No recordaba las palabras, pero sentía su eco en mis cuerdas vocales, el residuo de sonidos articulados con intención. Me quedé inmóvil, conteniendo la respiración, escuchando el silencio del departamento. Las tuberías murmuraban su letanía habitual. El refrigerador zumbaba desde la cocina. Y había algo más. Un sonido que no debería estar ahí. Un crujido leve, como el que produce la madera cuando alguien se acomoda sobre ella. Venía del rincón junto al armario. Encendí la luz y no encontré nada, por supuesto. Solo las sombras retrocediendo, el piso de parqué desgastado, una telaraña que brillaba en lo alto del techo. Me levanté a beber agua y pasé el resto de la noche con el televisor encendido, el volumen bajo, cualquier cosa que llenara aquel silencio que de pronto se había vuelto insoportable. Durante los días siguientes, la sensación de estar siendo observado se intensificó. No era algo constante, sino intermitente, como si una presencia entrara y saliera de mi percepción. A veces la notaba mientras cocinaba, un peso en la nuca que me hacía girar hacia el pasillo vacío. Otras veces me sorprendía mirando fijamente el rincón de la habitación sin recordar cuándo había empezado a hacerlo. Comencé a encontrar detalles que antes no había notado. Marcas en el piso cerca del armario, como si algo pesado se hubiera arrastrado repetidamente sobre la misma trayectoria. Manchas de humedad en el techo que formaban patrones que casi parecían deliberados, y un olor tenue, dulzón, que aparecía sin causa aparente y se desvanecía antes de que pudiera identificarlo. Fue entonces cuando decidí instalar las cámaras. Compré dos. Una con visión nocturna que coloqué sobre la cómoda, apuntando directamente hacia el rincón problemático, y otra en el recibidor, cubriendo el ángulo que daba a mi cama. Me dije que era una medida sensata, una forma de demostrarme que no había nada, que el divorcio y la soledad me estaban afectando más de lo que quería admitir. Mi exesposa siempre había dicho que tenía tendencia a obsesionarme con detalles insignificantes, a construir narrativas paranoicas a partir de coincidencias inocentes. Quizás tenía razón, quizás las cámaras me devolverían la cordura. La primera noche de grabación no pasó nada extraordinario. Me vi dormir durante 6 horas, moviéndome ocasionalmente, murmurando fragmentos incoherentes como cualquier persona normal. El rincón permaneció vacío y estático. Sentí un alivio que no duró mucho. La segunda noche fue diferente. Me desperté a las 4 de la madrugada con la misma sensación de haber estado hablando. Esta vez, sin embargo, recordaba fragmentos. Estaba describiendo algo, explicando detalles de mi rutina diaria con la paciencia de quien se dirige a alguien que escucha atentamente. Revisé las grabaciones con las manos temblando ligeramente, adelantando las horas nocturnas hasta encontrar el momento preciso. En la pantalla, me vi incorporarme en la cama a las 3:47. Tenía los ojos abiertos pero la mirada vacía, fija en el rincón junto al armario, y estaba hablando. Podía ver mis labios moviéndose, articulando palabras que el micrófono apenas captaba como un murmullo distante. Subí el volumen al máximo. Mi voz sonaba diferente, más lenta, con una cadencia que no reconocía como propia. Estaba explicando cómo había sido mi día, mencionando el café que había tomado por la mañana, la llamada de trabajo que me había irritado, el dolor de cabeza que sentí durante la tarde. Pero lo peor no fue eso. Lo peor fue que, en los intervalos entre mis frases, había respuestas. Sonidos que el micrófono registraba como estática, como interferencia, pero que tenían un ritmo, un patrón, como si alguien contestara desde muy lejos, a través de algo que distorsionaba su voz hasta convertirla en ruido blanco. Rebobiné la grabación una docena de veces. En cada reproducción, los sonidos parecían más definidos, más cercanos a palabras, o quizás mi mente desesperada estaba imponiendo significado donde no lo había. No podía estar seguro. Ya no podía estar seguro de nada. Las noches siguientes establecieron un patrón aterrador. Cada madrugada, entre las 3 y las 4, me incorporaba en la cama y comenzaba a hablar con el rincón vacío. Las conversaciones eran siempre unilaterales en apariencia, pero las pausas que hacía, los asentimientos de cabeza, las pequeñas sonrisas que a veces cruzaban mi rostro dormido, sugerían un diálogo completo que yo no recordaba al despertar. Y siempre, aquella estática con ritmo respondiendo desde la oscuridad. Comencé a dormir cada vez menos. El agotamiento se instaló en mis huesos como una enfermedad. Mis colegas en el trabajo notaron el cambio. Las ojeras profundas, los temblores en las manos, la dificultad para concentrarme en tareas simples. Uno de ellos me preguntó si estaba enfermo. Le dije que solo era insomnio. No le dije que había dejado de confiar en mi propia percepción, que cada sombra me parecía demasiado densa, que había empezado a notar un olor dulzón en mi ropa, un olor que no recordaba de dónde venía. Una noche, decidí no dormir. Me senté en la cama con la luz encendida, mirando fijamente el rincón, esperando. Las horas pasaron con lentitud agónica. A las 2:30 comencé a sentir un peso en los párpados. A las 3:15 la lámpara parpadeó una vez, 2 veces, y luego se estabilizó. A las 3:47 exactas sentí un cambio en la temperatura del cuarto. El aire se volvió más frío, más denso, con ese olor dulzón que ahora reconocía como algo orgánico, como el perfume de flores marchitas. Y entonces vi algo que no debería haber visto. En el rincón, donde la luz no llegaba completamente, la oscuridad se movió. No de la manera en que se mueven las sombras cuando algo las proyecta, sino de una forma autónoma, como si la ausencia de luz tuviera voluntad propia. Se contrajo sobre sí misma, adquiriendo una densidad imposible, y por un instante, por un fragmento de segundo que se estiró hasta convertirse en una eternidad, percibí una forma. No tenía contornos definidos, pero ocupaba espacio, desplazaba el aire, existía, y me estaba mirando. Grité. No recuerdo haberlo decidido, pero grité con una fuerza que me desgarró la garganta. La forma se disolvió instantáneamente, como si mi pánico la hubiera ahuyentado, o como si nunca hubiera estado allí. Me quedé temblando en la cama durante lo que pudieron ser minutos u horas, sin atreverme a apartar la vista del rincón ahora vacío. A la mañana siguiente, revisé la grabación de esa noche. La cámara había captado todo. Mi vigilia tensa, el parpadeo de la lámpara, mi cuerpo rígido mirando hacia el rincón. Pero en el momento exacto donde yo había visto la oscuridad moverse, la grabación mostraba algo diferente. El rincón permanecía estático, invariable. Sin embargo, el yo de la pantalla había girado la cabeza hacia la cámara y estaba sonriendo. Una sonrisa amplia, serena, que no recordaba haber esbozado. Y mis labios se movían, formando palabras que el micrófono captó con claridad esta vez. Estaba diciendo un nombre, mi nombre, pero no era mi voz la que lo pronunciaba. Llamé a mi exesposa esa tarde. Necesitaba hablar con alguien, anclarme a una realidad que se me escapaba como agua entre los dedos. Le conté todo. Las grabaciones, la vecina, el rincón, la cosa que había visto o imaginado. Ella escuchó en silencio y luego, con un tono que mezclaba preocupación y algo más frío, me sugirió que buscara ayuda profesional. Me recordó que mi padre había sufrido episodios similares antes de su internación, que estas cosas podían ser hereditarias. Colgué sin responder. Esa noche, antes de dormir, hice algo que no puedo explicar. Me acerqué al rincón y hablé en voz alta. Pregunté quién estaba ahí. ¿Qué quería? ¿Por qué me había elegido? El silencio fue absoluto, casi ofensivo en su completitud. Me sentí ridículo, un hombre adulto hablando con las sombras de su habitación. Me acosté riendo de mi propia paranoia, pero antes de cerrar los ojos, escuché algo, un susurro tan tenue que podría haber sido el viento, o las tuberías, o mi imaginación colapsando sobre sí misma. Un susurro que parecía venir de todos los rincones a la vez, y que decía, con una claridad imposible, que no me había elegido, que yo la había invitado. Escribo esto una semana después. He dejado de revisar las grabaciones porque ya no las necesito. Cada mañana despierto con recuerdos fragmentarios de conversaciones nocturnas, de secretos compartidos con algo que habita en los espacios donde la luz no llega. A veces encuentro palabras escritas en el vaho del espejo del baño, palabras que reconozco como mi propia letra pero que no recuerdo haber trazado. Otras veces despierto en lugares diferentes de donde me dormí, siempre más cerca del rincón. Mi vecina dejó de saludarme, se persigna cuando me cruza en las escaleras, y yo, por las noches, antes de que el sueño me arrastre hacia esas conversaciones que no recuerdo, miro el rincón junto al armario y noto que la oscuridad allí es diferente, más cálida, más familiar, como si algo me esperara con la paciencia de quien sabe que, tarde o temprano, todos terminamos aceptando a nuestros compañeros invisibles. Anoche, por primera vez, no tuve miedo. Y eso es lo que más me aterra. Historia 4. La primera mancha apareció el martes, justo después de 3 días de lluvia incesante. Era pequeña, del tamaño de un puño cerrado, y ocupaba una esquina del techo de nuestra habitación, cerca del ventilador que nunca usábamos. Mi esposa dijo que llamáramos a alguien para revisar el techo, pero yo le aseguré que no era nada grave. El edificio tenía más de 40 años. Estas cosas pasaban. Me acosté esa noche sin pensar demasiado en ella, aunque recuerdo haber sentido algo extraño mientras la miraba fijamente antes de apagar la luz. Una sensación difusa, como cuando alguien te observa desde el otro lado de una ventana oscura. Desperté a las 3 de la madrugada con la garganta seca y un peso invisible sobre el pecho. La habitación olía diferente, a humedad vieja, a sótano abandonado, a algo orgánico pudriéndose lentamente bajo capas de pintura. Mi esposa dormía a mi lado, su respiración lenta y profunda, completamente ajena a lo que fuera que me había arrancado del sueño. Miré hacia el techo por instinto. La mancha había crecido. Ahora era del tamaño de un plato, y su forma ya no era la de una simple infiltración. Había bordes irregulares, protuberancias oscuras que se curvaban hacia adentro, y en el centro, 2 zonas más claras que parecían... No. Cerré los ojos con fuerza. Cuando los abrí, todo seguía igual. 2 zonas claras, simétricas, como cuencas vacías. Me dije que era una coincidencia, que el cerebro humano está programado para encontrar rostros en todas partes. Pareidolia, se llama. Lo había leído en alguna revista científica años atrás. Es un mecanismo de supervivencia, nada más. No había nada sobrenatural en una mancha de humedad con forma vagamente antropomórfica. Pero no pude volver a dormir esa noche. Los días siguientes trajeron más lluvia y más manchas. Conté 3 el jueves, 5 el viernes. Se extendían por el techo como un mapa de constelaciones enfermas, cada una con su propia textura, su propio tono de gris verdoso. Algunas eran apenas sombras difusas, otras tenían contornos más definidos, más inquietantes. Mi esposa finalmente llamó a un especialista en impermeabilización, pero el hombre más temprano disponible era hasta la semana siguiente. Mientras tanto, colocamos un balde en la esquina del cuarto para recoger las gotas que ocasionalmente caían del techo. El sonido de cada gota golpeando el plástico se convirtió en un metrónomo perverso que marcaba el ritmo de mis noches insomnes. Fue el sábado cuando noté algo que me heló la sangre. Estaba acostado en la cama, mirando hacia arriba con esa fascinación morbosa que uno desarrolla hacia las cosas que le aterran, cuando me di cuenta de que las manchas habían cambiado. No solo habían crecido, se habían reorganizado. Las 2 zonas claras que había visto en la primera mancha ahora estaban más definidas, más hundidas, y debajo de ellas había aparecido una tercera abertura, alargada, vertical, como una boca abierta en un grito silencioso. Le pregunté a mi esposa si ella también lo veía. Me miró con esa expresión que reservaba para cuando pensaba que estaba exagerando, y me dijo que solo veía manchas de humedad. Manchas feas, sí, pero solo manchas. Me sugirió que tomara algo para dormir. Esa noche, mientras ella roncaba suavemente a mi lado, conté 7 rostros en el techo. 7 bocas abiertas, 7 pares de ojos vacíos que me miraban desde arriba. Empecé a documentar los cambios. Tomaba fotografías cada mañana y cada noche, comparándolas obsesivamente en busca de diferencias. En las imágenes, las manchas parecían inocentes, abstractas, simples daños por humedad en un techo viejo. Pero cuando las miraba directamente, sin la mediación de la pantalla, los rostros estaban ahí, cada vez más nítidos, cada vez más cerca. El lunes noté que uno de ellos tenía una característica nueva, una línea vertical que cruzaba lo que habría sido su frente, como una cicatriz antigua. Me recordó a alguien, pero no podía precisar a quién. Pasé horas tratando de ubicar ese recuerdo, ese rostro familiar, hasta que mi esposa me preguntó por qué estaba tan distraído. Le dije que era el trabajo, el estrés. Ella asintió sin convicción. Esa noche soñé con el techo. En el sueño, las manchas se movían, primero de forma imperceptible, como nubes de tormenta deslizándose lentamente por un cielo enfermo, luego más rápido, convergiendo hacia un punto central directamente sobre mi cabeza. Los rostros se fusionaban, se separaban, se multiplicaban, y todos, absolutamente todos, tenían esa cicatriz en la frente. Desperté gritando, con las sábanas empapadas en sudor frío y el corazón latiendo tan fuerte que podía sentirlo en mis sienes. Mi esposa no estaba en la cama, la encontré en la cocina, bebiendo agua. Me dijo que se había despertado porque yo estaba murmurando cosas en sueños. Palabras incomprensibles, dijo. Sonidos que no parecían de ningún idioma conocido. Me miró con una mezcla de preocupación y algo más. Algo que se parecía demasiado al miedo. El especialista vino el miércoles. Era un hombre mayor, de manos callosas y voz rasposa, que olía a tabaco y a pintura industrial. Subió al techo, bajó después de 20 minutos y me explicó que la impermeabilización original se había deteriorado. Necesitábamos una reparación mayor, pero mientras tanto podía aplicar un sellador temporal y pintar el techo para cubrir las manchas. Le dije que sí inmediatamente. Verlo trabajar fue casi terapéutico. Cada brochazo de pintura blanca borraba uno de esos rostros imposibles. Cada capa nueva era un muro entre yo y lo que fuera que estaba proyectando mi mente enferma. ¿Por qué tenía que ser eso, verdad? Una proyección, un síntoma de algo que necesitaba atención médica. Cuando el hombre terminó, el techo era un lienzo inmaculado, limpio, vacío. Esa noche dormí profundamente por primera vez en semanas, pero la paz duró exactamente 3 horas. Desperté a las 4 de la madrugada con esa misma sensación de opresión en el pecho, ese mismo olor a podredumbre húmeda que ninguna pintura podía disfrazar. Miré hacia arriba, aunque una parte de mí sabía lo que iba a encontrar. Los rostros habían vuelto. No solo habían vuelto, eran más. Contaba 17 ahora, distribuidos en patrones geométricos imposibles que parecían formar constelaciones de sufrimiento. La pintura nueva se había oscurecido en esos puntos precisos, como si las manchas hubieran emanado desde adentro del techo, atravesando cada capa de sellador y pintura con una determinación antinatural. Y había algo más, algo que me hizo contener la respiración hasta que los pulmones me ardieron. Estaban más cerca. No en el sentido de que el techo hubiera bajado, sino que los rostros mismos parecían proyectarse hacia abajo, como si intentaran atravesar la superficie que los contenía. Las bocas ya no eran simples aberturas oscuras, ahora tenían profundidad, textura, la sugerencia de dientes podridos asomándose en sus esquinas. Los ojos ya no eran cuencas vacías. Algo los llenaba ahora, algo húmedo y brillante que reflejaba la poca luz del reloj digital en mi mesita de noche. Salí del cuarto sin despertar a mi esposa. Dormí en el sofá de la sala, aunque dormir es una palabra generosa para lo que hice. Permanecer inmóvil con los ojos cerrados, escuchando cada crujido de la casa, cada gota que caía en el balde olvidado en la habitación, cada susurro del viento que sonaba demasiado parecido a palabras. Las semanas siguientes fueron un descenso gradual hacia algo que no puedo nombrar. Empecé a notar manchas en otros lugares, en el techo del baño, en las paredes del pasillo, en el espejo del vestíbulo. Ninguna tenía la definición de las del cuarto, pero todas sugerían formas, insinuaciones de facciones humanas apenas formándose. Mi esposa insistió en que viera a un médico. Fui para tranquilizarla. El profesional me hizo preguntas sobre mi sueño, mi alimentación, mis niveles de estrés. Me recetó unas pastillas para dormir y me recomendó reducir el consumo de cafeína. No le mencioné los rostros. Sabía exactamente cómo sonaría. Las pastillas funcionaron, al menos al principio. Me sumergían en un sueño negro y sin sueños del que emergía cada mañana sintiéndome más agotado que el día anterior, pero al menos no veía los rostros durante esas horas de inconsciencia química. Lo que no podía evitar era verlos durante el día. Empezaron a aparecer en todas partes, en las nubes que pasaban sobre el edificio, en las sombras que proyectaban los muebles, en los reflejos de las ventanas, superpuestos a mi propia imagen. Siempre los mismos rostros, bocas abiertas en gritos mudos, ojos que me seguían con una intensidad imposible para simples manchas de humedad. Mi esposa comenzó a pasar más tiempo fuera de casa. Decía que era por trabajo, pero yo notaba cómo me miraba cuando creía que no estaba observando, con el mismo miedo con el que uno mira a un animal herido que podría volverse peligroso. Le pregunté una noche si ella también los veía. Me respondió que no sabía de qué estaba hablando, que solo veía manchas, que necesitaba descansar, que quizás debería llamar a alguien. No especificó a quién. Fue un jueves cuando finalmente entendí. Estaba solo en la casa, acostado en la cama que había empezado a sentir como un altar de sacrificio, mirando los rostros del techo con una resignación que bordeaba la familiaridad. Había aprendido a distinguirlos individualmente, el de la cicatriz en la frente, el de la boca torcida hacia la izquierda, el que parecía más joven que los demás, el que tenía una expresión que no era de terror sino de algo peor, algo como reconocimiento. Llevaba horas inmóvil cuando noté que uno de los rostros me resultaba más familiar que los otros. No familiar como un recuerdo vago o una asociación inconsciente, familiar como algo que veía todos los días. Me levanté de la cama lentamente, sin apartar la vista del techo. Caminé hacia el baño con pasos medidos, calculados, y encendí la luz. El espejo sobre el lavabo me devolvió mi reflejo, ojeroso, demacrado, envejecido 10 años en pocas semanas, y ahí estaba, la cicatriz, una línea vertical que cruzaba mi frente, tan tenue que nunca la había notado, tan real que no podía dejar de verla ahora que sabía que estaba ahí. Volví al cuarto, miré el techo, conté los rostros uno por uno, estudiando cada detalle con una atención que rayaba en la demencia. La boca torcida, los ojos hundidos, la expresión de un hombre que ha visto demasiado y no ha podido olvidar nada. Todos eran yo. Cada rostro en el techo era una versión distorsionada de mi propia cara, gritando en silencio desde una dimensión de humedad y podredumbre. Me vi a mí mismo multiplicado en 17 variaciones de sufrimiento, 17 instantes congelados de un terror que aún no había experimentado, pero que, de alguna forma imposible, ya había dejado su marca en el techo de mi habitación. Escuché la puerta de entrada abrirse. Mi esposa había vuelto. Sus pasos resonaron en el pasillo, acercándose al cuarto. No me moví, no podía moverme. Ella apareció en el marco de la puerta y me preguntó qué estaba haciendo. Su voz sonaba distante, como si llegara desde el fondo de un pozo muy profundo. Le pedí que mirara hacia arriba, que me dijera qué veía, que por favor, me confirmara que no estaba perdiendo la razón. Mi esposa levantó la vista hacia el techo, y por primera vez en semanas, su expresión cambió. El color abandonó su rostro. Sus labios se abrieron como si fuera a decir algo, pero ningún sonido emergió de ellos. Seguí su mirada. El techo había cambiado otra vez. Ahora había un rostro nuevo entre los míos. Un rostro de mujer, de rasgos suaves y ojos que reconocería en cualquier parte. Y ella también estaba gritando. Historia 5. La primera vez que noté algo extraño fue por el olor. Un aroma dulzón, casi imperceptible, que flotaba en el pasillo de la planta alta como si alguien hubiera dejado flores marchitas dentro de las paredes. Mi esposa no lo percibía, o al menos eso decía. Pero yo lo sentía cada noche, justo antes de dormir, colándose bajo la puerta de nuestra habitación como un aliento tibio y antiguo. Compramos la casa en febrero, cuando el jardín era solo un rectángulo de tierra helada y los árboles del vecindario parecían esqueletos negros contra el cielo gris. El precio era absurdamente bajo para una propiedad de ese tamaño. El agente inmobiliario mencionó algo sobre una situación delicada con los propietarios anteriores, pero nosotros estábamos demasiado entusiasmados con los techos altos y la chimenea de piedra como para hacer preguntas incómodas. Ahora pienso en eso constantemente. En las preguntas que no hicimos, en las señales que elegimos ignorar. Las primeras semanas fueron normales, o eso quiero creer. Desempacamos cajas, discutimos sobre dónde colocar el sofá, pintamos las paredes del estudio de un verde pálido que mi esposa había elegido de un catálogo. Pero incluso entonces había pequeñas cosas que no encajaban del todo. La mancha en el techo de la cocina, por ejemplo. Tenía la forma aproximada de una mano extendida, con los dedos apuntando hacia la ventana que daba al patio trasero. La cubrimos con pintura blanca 3 veces, pero cada mañana reaparecía, un poco más oscura, como si algo debajo estuviera filtrándose hacia la superficie, y estaban los ruidos. No eran los crujidos típicos de una casa vieja asentándose sobre sus cimientos. Eran pasos suaves, casi tímidos, que recorrían el pasillo superior a las 3 de la madrugada. Yo me quedaba inmóvil en la cama, con los ojos clavados en el techo, sintiendo el peso de algo moviéndose justo encima de nosotros. Cuando se lo mencioné a mi esposa, ella murmuró algo sobre tuberías y se dio la vuelta para seguir durmiendo. Pero yo escuchaba. Y cada noche, los pasos se acercaban un poco más a nuestra puerta. Fue en marzo cuando empezaron los sueños. En ellos, yo estaba en la cocina, nuestra cocina, con las mismas baldosas agrietadas y el mismo refrigerador que zumbaba demasiado fuerte, pero todo tenía un tinte amarillento, como una fotografía vieja. Preparaba café en una cafetera que no reconocía, aunque mis manos se movían con la familiaridad de quien ha repetido ese gesto 1000 veces. A veces, una voz de mujer me llamaba desde el piso de arriba. No era la voz de mi esposa. Era más aguda, más nerviosa, teñida de algo que tardé semanas en identificar. Miedo. Despertaba empapado en sudor, con el corazón golpeándome las costillas y un sabor metálico en la boca. Lo que más me perturbaba no era el contenido del sueño, sino la sensación de que no era realmente un sueño. Era un recuerdo que no me pertenecía. Una mañana, mientras buscaba una caja de herramientas en el sótano, encontré la cafetera. Estaba cubierta de polvo, escondida detrás de un montón de periódicos viejos que los anteriores propietarios habían dejado. Era exactamente igual a la de mis sueños, roja, con una grieta en el mango y una calcomanía desteñida de un sol sonriente. Me quedé mirándola durante varios minutos, sintiendo como algo frío se arrastraba por mi columna vertebral. Después la dejé donde estaba y nunca le mencioné nada a mi esposa. Los cambios en ella comenzaron a finales de ese mes. Al principio fueron sutilezas. Se cortó el cabello de una forma que nunca antes había llevado. Un flequillo recto que le cubría las cejas y le daba un aspecto extrañamente anticuado. Empezó a usar un perfume diferente, uno que yo no había comprado y que ella no recordaba haber adquirido. Cuando le pregunté de dónde lo había sacado, me miró con genuina confusión, como si la pregunta no tuviera sentido. Lo encontré en su tocador, dijo finalmente. Debió estar ahí desde antes. Pero nosotros habíamos limpiado cada rincón de la casa, cada cajón, cada armario, cada estante. Yo mismo había vaciado ese tocador y lo había lijado antes de que ella lo usara. Una noche la encontré de pie frente a la ventana del dormitorio, mirando hacia el jardín oscuro. No se movía, ni siquiera parecía respirar. Me acerqué y le toqué el hombro, y cuando se giró, sus ojos tardaron un segundo en enfocarme, como si estuviera regresando de muy lejos. Estaba pensando en las rosas, dijo. Deberíamos plantar rosas en el jardín. A mi esposa siempre le habían parecido vulgares las rosas. Preferís las orquídeas, le recordé. Pero ella solo sonrió de una manera que no reconocí y volvió a mirar por la ventana. Abril trajo consigo una paranoia que me consumía como una fiebre lenta. Empecé a notar patrones. Cada martes, mi esposa preparaba el mismo platillo para cenar, un guiso de carne con papas que nunca habíamos comido antes de mudarnos. Cada jueves por la noche, ella subía al ático, un espacio que ambos habíamos acordado no usar, y permanecía allí durante horas, en completo silencio. Cuando le preguntaba qué hacía, me respondía con evasivas, o peor aún, no recordaba haber subido. Yo también tenía mis rutinas nuevas, aunque me costó más tiempo admitirlo. Me descubrí a mí mismo revisando las cerraduras exactamente 7 veces antes de acostarme. Miraba por la ventana del estudio hacia la casa del vecino de enfrente. Un hombre mayor que nunca habíamos conocido formalmente, con una intensidad que bordeaba la obsesión. Una madrugada, mientras inspeccionaba las sombras del jardín trasero, vi algo que me heló la sangre. Mis propias huellas en la tierra húmeda, marcando un camino desde la puerta de la cocina hasta el cobertizo del fondo. Yo no recordaba haber salido. La mañana siguiente encontré tierra debajo de mis uñas y un par de tijeras de podar en el bolsillo de mi bata. Tenían manchas oscuras en las hojas que preferí no examinar de cerca. Fue el vecino quien plantó la semilla que germinaría en mi mente durante las semanas siguientes. Lo encontré podando su seto una tarde, y algo en su expresión me detuvo. Me miraba con una mezcla de compasión y algo más, algo parecido al miedo. ¿Ustedes saben lo que pasó aquí?, preguntó sin rodeos. Le expliqué que el agente había mencionado algo vagamente, pero que no conocíamos los detalles. El hombre asintió lentamente, como si mis palabras confirmaran algo que ya sospechaba. No hubo... Hizo una pausa, eligiendo sus palabras con cuidado. No hubo un final. Ellos desaparecieron antes de que nadie pudiera entender qué estaba pasando. Pero los últimos meses, antes de irse, actuaban raro. Hacían las mismas cosas una y otra vez, como si estuvieran atrapados en un ciclo. ¿Qué clase de cosas?, pregunté, sintiendo cómo el aire se volvía más espeso a mi alrededor. El vecino me miró con una intensidad que me hizo retroceder un paso involuntariamente. Después bajó la voz hasta convertirla en un susurro. Exactamente las mismas cosas que ustedes están haciendo ahora. No dijo nada más, simplemente volvió a su seto, como si la conversación nunca hubiera ocurrido, pero sus palabras se quedaron adheridas a mi mente como una mancha imposible de limpiar. Esa noche, mientras mi esposa dormía, bajé al sótano con una linterna. Los periódicos que había visto antes seguían ahí, pero esta vez me obligué a mirarlos más de cerca. Eran de hacía 2 años. Los titulares hablaban de una pareja que había desaparecido sin dejar rastro, sin señales de violencia, sin nota de despedida. Simplemente se habían evaporado de su propia casa, dejando la cena a medio preparar y todas sus pertenencias intactas. Las fotografías me quitaron el aliento. Ella tenía el mismo corte de cabello que mi esposa llevaba ahora. Él, el hombre de la foto, cuyo rostro estaba ligeramente borroso por la mala calidad de la impresión, sostenía unas tijeras de podar y sonreía junto a un rosal. Sentí que las paredes del sótano se cerraban a mi alrededor. El olor dulzón que había estado percibiendo durante meses se intensificó hasta volverse casi insoportable, llenando mis pulmones de algo que sabía a putrefacción y a nostalgia. Y entonces escuché los pasos arriba, los mismos pasos de siempre, pero esta vez reconocí su ritmo. Era mi propio ritmo, mi propia forma de caminar. Subí las escaleras en estado de trance. La puerta de nuestra habitación estaba entreabierta y una luz tenue se filtraba por el hueco. Me acerqué sin hacer ruido, con el corazón latiendo tan fuerte que estaba seguro de que podía escucharse en toda la casa. Lo que vi me paralizó. Mi esposa estaba sentada frente a su tocador, cepillándose el cabello con movimientos lentos y mecánicos. Pero su reflejo en el espejo no coincidía exactamente con sus gestos. Había un desfase mínimo, una fracción de segundo de diferencia que resultaba profundamente perturbadora, como si el reflejo fuera una grabación reproduciéndose con un ligero retraso. Ella giró la cabeza hacia mí, pero el reflejo continuó mirando hacia adelante, cepillándose un cabello que ya no estaba ahí. Y sonrió. «Estaba esperándote», dijo con una voz que no era del todo suya, que tenía un eco, como si hablaran 2 personas al mismo tiempo. «¿Ya encontraste las tijeras?» Las tijeras de podar estaban en mi mano. No recordaba haberlas recogido. Han pasado 3 semanas desde esa noche. Ya no sé con certeza qué día es. Los calendarios de la casa muestran fechas diferentes cada vez que los miro. Mi teléfono perdió la señal hace días, o quizás semanas. He dejado de intentar salir al jardín porque cada vez que lo hago, termino parado frente al cobertizo sin recordar cómo llegué ahí. Mi esposa y yo ya casi no hablamos. Nos movemos por la casa siguiendo rutinas que no elegimos, preparando comidas que no recordamos haber aprendido, sentándonos en sillas que no son cómodas porque ya no importa la comodidad. A veces la miro y veo a otra persona asomándose detrás de sus ojos. A veces me miro en el espejo y no reconozco al hombre que me devuelve la mirada. El vecino ya no sale de su casa. O quizás sí sale, y simplemente yo no puedo verlo porque estoy mirando en la dirección equivocada. Lo único que sé con certeza es esto: hay un final acercándose. Lo siento como una presión en el pecho, como un zumbido constante en los oídos. Pronto, algo va a pasar. Algo que ha pasado antes. Anoche, mientras revisaba las cerraduras por 7ª vez, encontré algo grabado en la madera de la puerta principal, letras toscas, hechas con algo afilado. Las palabras eran simples, pero me helaron hasta los huesos. Ellos también pensaban que podían escapar. Y debajo, en una caligrafía que reconocí como mi propia letra, no hay salida, solo repetición. No recuerdo haberlo escrito, pero las astillas bajo mis uñas me dicen que lo hice. O quizás lo hará el hombre que vivirá aquí después de nosotros. O quizás ya lo hizo el que vivió antes. En esta casa, el tiempo es un pasillo circular, y todos los que entran terminan caminando hacia el mismo destino. Puedo escuchar los pasos acercándose ahora mismo. Vienen de arriba, vienen de afuera, vienen de dentro de mí. Y lo peor de todo es que ya no estoy seguro de si son los pasos de algo que me persigue, o simplemente el eco de mis propios pies, siguiendo un camino que alguien trazó mucho antes de que yo naciera. La puerta del ático está abierta esta noche. Creo que voy a subir. Creo que siempre iba a subir. Historia 6. El olor fue lo primero que noté al abrir la puerta del departamento 301. No era desagradable exactamente, sino antiguo, como el interior de un ropero que ha permanecido cerrado durante décadas. Mezclado con ese aroma había algo más, algo dulce y vagamente familiar que no supe identificar en ese momento. El agente inmobiliario me aseguró que solo necesitaba ventilación, que el inquilino anterior había sido un hombre solitario con poca afición por las corrientes de aire. Le creí porque necesitaba creerle. El precio era demasiado bueno, el edificio estaba cerca de mi nuevo trabajo, y yo acababa de atravesar un divorcio que me había dejado sin hogar y sin ganas de seguir buscando. Me mudé un viernes de marzo, cuando el cielo tenía ese color gris uniforme que parece absorber todos los sonidos de la ciudad. El edificio era una construcción de los años 60, con pasillos estrechos iluminados por fluorescentes que parpadeaban de manera intermitente y un ascensor que gemía como un animal enfermo cada vez que se ponía en movimiento. Mi piso era el tercero, el último antes de la azotea, y solo había 4 departamentos por nivel. El mío quedaba al final del pasillo, junto a una escalera de emergencia cuya puerta metálica siempre estaba fría al tacto, incluso en los días más cálidos. Durante la primera semana me dediqué a desempacar cajas y a familiarizarme con los ruidos del edificio. Cada estructura tiene su propio lenguaje. El crujido de las tuberías cuando alguien abre el agua caliente, el zumbido del transformador en el sótano, el eco de pasos en el piso superior. Aprendí a distinguir el sonido del ascensor deteniéndose en mi planta del que hacía al pasar de largo. Aprendí que las paredes eran más delgadas de lo que aparentaban y que podía escuchar, si prestaba atención, el murmullo distante de un televisor encendido en algún departamento vecino. Lo que no esperaba aprender era el sonido de 3 golpes suaves en mi puerta, exactamente a las 7 de la noche. La primera vez que ocurrió, el lunes de mi segunda semana, me encontraba en la cocina preparando una cena sencilla. Los golpes fueron tan tenues que al principio pensé que los había imaginado, pero se repitieron, con la misma cadencia pausada, y cuando abrí la puerta me encontré con una mujer de edad avanzada que sostenía un plato cubierto con un paño de cocina bordado. Tenía el cabello blanco recogido en un moño descuidado y vestía una bata de casa con un estampado de flores descoloridas. Sus ojos, de un azul acuoso, me miraron con una expresión que interpreté como amabilidad maternal. Me dijo que vivía en el 302, justo al lado, y que había notado que era nuevo en el edificio. Había preparado demasiada comida y pensó que tal vez me gustaría un poco. Su voz era suave, casi un susurro, y tuve que inclinarme ligeramente para escucharla bien. Acepté el plato por cortesía, agradecí el gesto, y ella asintió con una sonrisa antes de alejarse por el pasillo con pasos tan silenciosos que apenas pude escucharlos. El contenido del plato era un guiso de aspecto casero, con papas y trozos de carne en una salsa espesa y oscura. Olía bien, reconfortante incluso, pero algo me impidió probarlo. Quizás fue la textura gelatinosa que adquirió al enfriarse, o el hecho de que no conocía a esa mujer en absoluto. Lo guardé en el refrigerador con la intención de tirarlo al día siguiente, cuando el sentimiento de culpa por desperdiciar comida se hubiera disipado. La noche siguiente, a las 7 en punto, los golpes se repitieron. Esta vez la mujer traía un plato de galletas. Me explicó, con esa misma voz susurrante, que le gustaba hornear pero que vivía sola y no podía consumir todo lo que preparaba. Le agradecí nuevamente, cerré la puerta y examiné las galletas bajo la luz de la cocina. Parecían normales, con chispas de chocolate y bordes ligeramente dorados. Pero cuando las acerqué a mi nariz, detecté ese mismo olor dulce y antiguo que había percibido el primer día, ese aroma que no lograba identificar pero que me provocaba una inquietud difusa en el estómago. Las tiré a la basura. Al tercer día comencé a sentir curiosidad por mi vecina. Decidí presentarme formalmente y tal vez llevarle algo a cambio de sus atenciones. Salí al pasillo y me dirigí al 302. La puerta era idéntica a la mía, pintada de ese verde institucional que caracterizaba a todo el edificio, pero noté que la mirilla estaba cubierta desde adentro y que no había felpudo ni ningún otro indicio de personalización. Toqué 3 veces y esperé. No hubo respuesta. Volví a tocar, esta vez con más fuerza, y el sonido pareció rebotar en un espacio vacío. Pegué mi oído a la puerta y no escuché nada, ni el crujido de pasos, ni el murmullo de un televisor, ni siquiera el zumbido de un refrigerador. Esa noche, exactamente a las 7, los golpes llegaron de nuevo. Abrí la puerta con una pregunta preparada en los labios, pero las palabras murieron antes de salir. La mujer estaba ahí, con otro plato cubierto, la misma sonrisa suave, los mismos ojos acuosos. Le pregunté cómo era posible que no hubiera escuchado cuando toqué su puerta esa tarde. Ella ladeó la cabeza como si no comprendiera la pregunta, y luego murmuró algo sobre que a veces se quedaba dormida temprano. Me ofreció el plato, que esta vez contenía empanadas pequeñas con los bordes cuidadosamente sellados, y se alejó antes de que pudiera decir nada más. La observé caminar hacia el 302 y buscar algo en el bolsillo de su bata. Escuché el sonido metálico de llaves, el clic de una cerradura abriéndose, y luego la puerta se cerró detrás de ella con un golpe sordo. Me quedé en el umbral durante varios minutos, mirando esa puerta verde, con las empanadas enfriándose en mis manos. Algo estaba mal. No podría explicar exactamente qué me perturbaba tanto de aquellos encuentros. La mujer parecía genuinamente amable. Sus gestos no tenían nada de amenazante, y sin embargo, cada vez que cerraba la puerta después de recibirla, sentía un escalofrío recorrer mi espalda, como si algo me observara desde las sombras del pasillo. Comencé a prestar más atención a los detalles. Su ropa, por ejemplo, siempre era la misma. La bata de flores descoloridas, las pantuflas gastadas, el moño desprolijo, y sus manos, cuando me entregaba los platos, estaban frías. No frías como las de alguien que viene del exterior, sino frías de una manera profunda, como si la temperatura hubiera abandonado su cuerpo hacía mucho tiempo. Decidí investigar. El portero era un hombre huraño de unos 60 años que pasaba la mayor parte del día encerrado en un cuarto diminuto junto a la entrada, rodeado de monitores que mostraban imágenes granuladas de los pasillos y el estacionamiento. Cuando le pregunté por la mujer del 302, su expresión cambió de manera casi imperceptible. Un endurecimiento alrededor de los ojos, un apretón en la mandíbula. Me dijo que el departamento 302 estaba vacío. Había estado vacío durante los últimos 2 años, desde que su ocupante, una mujer mayor que vivía sola, había sido encontrada en su interior después de que los vecinos reportaran un olor extraño en el pasillo. Sentí que el suelo se inclinaba bajo mis pies. Le pedí que repitiera lo que había dicho, convencido de que había escuchado mal. El portero me miró con una mezcla de impaciencia y algo que podría haber sido lástima. La mujer del 302 había fallecido hacía 2 años, me confirmó. Su cuerpo fue descubierto varios días después porque no tenía familia ni amigos cercanos que la visitaran. Nadie había querido alquilar el departamento desde entonces, a pesar de que la administración había bajado el precio varias veces. La gente es supersticiosa, agregó, y luego volvió a sus monitores como dando por terminada la conversación. Subí a mi piso en un estado de aturdimiento. El pasillo estaba en silencio, los fluorescentes parpadeaban con su ritmo habitual, y la puerta del 302 permanecía cerrada e inmóvil. Me acerqué a ella y la examiné con cuidado. No había luz filtrándose por debajo, no había sonidos provenientes del interior. Toqué la superficie de madera y la sentí helada, mucho más fría que cualquier otra superficie del edificio. Retrocedí hacia mi departamento sin darle la espalda a esa puerta, como si temiera que pudiera abrirse en cualquier momento. A las 7 de la noche, los golpes llegaron. No abrí. Me quedé paralizado en el centro de la sala, escuchando esos 3 golpes suaves, pacientes, repetirse cada 30 segundos durante casi 15 minutos. Luego, silencio. Un silencio tan denso que podía escuchar mi propia sangre circulando por mis oídos. Me acerqué a la mirilla y miré hacia el pasillo. Estaba vacío, pero sobre mi felpudo había un plato cubierto con un paño de cocina bordado. Esa noche no dormí. Pasé las horas oscuras sentado en el sofá, mirando la puerta, esperando que los golpes regresaran, pero no lo hicieron. Al amanecer, cuando la luz grisácea comenzó a filtrarse por las persianas, me armé de valor y salí al pasillo. El plato seguía ahí, frío al tacto. Lo levanté con cuidado y aparté el paño. Adentro había un trozo de pastel de manzana, perfectamente cortado, con una capa de azúcar glass que brillaba bajo la luz artificial. El aroma era dulce, empalagoso, y de pronto supe por qué me resultaba tan familiar. Olía como las flores secas que se dejan en los velorios. Los días siguientes fueron una tortura de anticipación. Comencé a marcar las horas en mi reloj, sintiendo cómo la ansiedad crecía a medida que se acercaban las 7 de la noche. Busqué información sobre el edificio, sobre la mujer que había vivido en el 302, pero no encontré nada útil. Los vecinos del piso parecían evitarme, o quizás era yo quien los evitaba a ellos. Empecé a dudar de mis propios recuerdos. ¿Realmente había visto a esa mujer? ¿Realmente había escuchado su voz? Los platos que había guardado en el refrigerador habían desaparecido, aunque no recordaba haberlos tirado. La basura donde había arrojado las galletas estaba vacía. Una noche decidí quedarme en el pasillo antes de las 7. Me senté en el suelo, con la espalda contra la pared, y esperé. A las 6:58 escuché un sonido proveniente de la escalera de emergencia. Un crujido suave, como de articulaciones antiguas poniéndose en movimiento. A las 6:59 la puerta del 302 se abrió lentamente, sin que nadie la empujara desde adentro. Y a las 7 de la mañana exactas, vi una sombra deslizarse desde ese umbral oscuro hacia mi puerta. Corrí. No recuerdo haber bajado las escaleras, no recuerdo haber cruzado el vestíbulo, no recuerdo haber salido a la calle. Solo sé que cuando volví en mí estaba a varias cuadras del edificio, temblando bajo la lluvia que había comenzado a caer sin que lo notara. Caminé durante horas, incapaz de regresar, incapaz de pensar con claridad. Cuando finalmente volví, el sol estaba saliendo y el edificio tenía un aspecto casi normal bajo la luz del amanecer. Subí a mi piso con el corazón latiendo dolorosamente en el pecho. El pasillo estaba vacío, silencioso. La puerta del 302 estaba cerrada, igual que siempre. Pero cuando me acerqué a mi propia puerta, noté algo que me hizo detener en seco. Había marcas en la madera. Eran tenues, casi invisibles, pero cuando pasé los dedos por la superficie, pude sentirlas. 3 marcas paralelas, a la altura donde alguien golpearía si quisiera llamar la atención. Parecían rasguños, o quizás solo desgaste natural. Me dije que siempre habían estado ahí, que simplemente no las había notado antes. Me lo dije, pero no me lo creí. Han pasado 3 semanas desde esa noche. Sigo viviendo en el departamento 301 porque no tengo a dónde ir y porque una parte de mí, una parte que preferiría ignorar, necesita entender qué está pasando. Los golpes continúan, puntuales, inevitables, cada noche a las 7. A veces abro la puerta y encuentro platos con comida que nunca pruebo. A veces no abro y los platos aparecen de todas formas sobre mi felpudo. Una vez, solo una vez, me atreví a mirar por la mirilla en el momento exacto de los golpes. No vi a nadie, pero escuché una voz, suave como un susurro, que decía que había preparado demasiada comida y que pensaba que tal vez me gustaría un poco. El portero insiste en que el 302 está vacío. Los otros vecinos afirman no haber visto nunca a ninguna mujer mayor en el edificio. Cuando les describo la bata de flores, el moño blanco, los ojos acuosos, me miran con expresiones que oscilan entre la confusión y la preocupación. Uno de ellos, el del 304, me sugirió amablemente que quizás debería hablar con alguien, un profesional que pudiera ayudarme con el estrés de la mudanza y el divorcio. A veces pienso que tiene razón. A veces pienso que estoy perdiendo la cabeza, que el aislamiento y la soledad han comenzado a fracturar algo dentro de mí. Pero entonces llegan las 7 de la noche y los golpes suenan en mi puerta y el olor a flores secas se filtra por las rendijas y sé que no estoy imaginando nada. Anoche encontré algo diferente junto al plato de comida. Era una fotografía vieja, descolorida por el tiempo, de una mujer joven con un vestido de novia. La di vuelta y en el reverso había una fecha de hacía más de 50 años, escrita con una caligrafía temblorosa. Debajo de la fecha, una sola palabra: gracias. No sé qué significa, no sé si quiero saberlo. Lo único que sé es que esta noche, cuando lleguen las 7, los golpes sonarán de nuevo. Y yo estaré aquí, esperando, preguntándome si la mujer del otro lado de la puerta es un fantasma, un producto de mi mente enferma, o algo completamente diferente que aún no comprendo. Preguntándome, sobre todo, qué pasará el día que finalmente decida probar la comida que me ofrece. Historia 7. The first time I noticed it, I dismissed it as the house settling. Old homes breathe, my wife reminded me when I mentioned the sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to originate from somewhere inside the wall between our bedroom and the guest room at the end of the hall. We had moved in 3 weeks prior, drawn by the Victorian charm and the generous square footage that the real estate listing had promised. The price had been suspiciously reasonable for such a property, but desperation has a way of silencing prudence. We needed space. We needed quiet. We needed to escape the suffocating apartment where our marriage had begun to curdle under the weight of proximity and resentment. The tapping stopped after a few nights. I convinced myself it had been pipes, perhaps rodents in the walls, nothing that a good exterminator couldn't remedy. But then came other things, subtler disturbances that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of my consciousness. The guest room door, which I distinctly remembered closing before bed, would stand ajar in the morning. The hallway seemed longer at night, the distance between our bedroom and the bathroom stretching in ways that defied the logic of architecture. And there was the smell, faint, elusive, something between old paper and the metallic tang of stagnant water that would materialize without warning and vanish before I could trace its source. My wife noticed none of this, or claimed not to. She slept deeply, peacefully, while I lay awake cataloging the small wrongnesses that had begun to colonize our new home. I started sleeping with the bedside lamp on, a childish habit I had abandoned decades ago, now resurrected by a nameless dread I couldn't articulate even to myself. It was during a weekend project. We had decided to repaint the guest room a pale sage green that I found the blueprints. They were rolled up in a cardboard tube at the back of the basement storage closet, forgotten by some previous owner, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. I spread them across the kitchen table that evening, tracing the faded lines with my fingertip while my wife prepared dinner. The domestic sounds of clattering pans and running water providing a thin membrane of normalcy against the unease that had taken root in my chest. The blueprints dated from 1923, the year the house was built. I followed the layout of the second floor with academic interest. Our bedroom, the bathroom, the guest room, all rendered in precise architectural notation. And then I saw it. Between our bedroom and the guest room, there was a space. Not a closet, not a bathroom, not any room that existed in the physical house as I knew it. A narrow rectangle, perhaps 6 feet by 8, with no doors, no windows, no apparent means of entry or exit. The measurements were clear, unambiguous. According to the original plans, there was a room in our house that shouldn't exist. I measured the hallway that night after my wife had gone to bed. I measured it 3 times, each calculation confirming what the blueprints had suggested. The distance from our bedroom door to the guest room door was approximately 4 feet shorter than it should have been. 4 feet of wall that concealed something, a void, a cavity, a space that the house itself seemed to have swallowed and hidden from view. When I told my wife, she laughed, not unkindly, but with the dismissive affection one reserves for a partner's eccentricities. Old blueprints often had errors, she said. Perhaps the plans had been revised during construction. Perhaps the space had been incorporated into the adjacent rooms at some point in the house's century-long history. Her explanations were reasonable, logical, delivered with the patient condescension of someone who believed themselves to be humoring a minor delusion. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. At work, during meetings, in the shower, while eating, my mind returned obsessively to that hidden rectangle on the yellowed paper. I began researching the house's history at the local library, poring over property records and old newspaper archives. The previous owners had been unremarkable, a retired professor who had died of natural causes in a nursing home, a young couple who had moved to California, an elderly widow who had lived alone for 30 years before relocating to an assisted living facility. Nothing sinister, nothing to suggest why a room would be sealed away and erased from the functional layout of the house. And yet, the noises returned. Not tapping this time, but something worse. A low, sustained hum that seemed to emanate from the wall itself, vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of comfortable perception. I would wake at 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, my body rigid with a terror I couldn't name, certain that something had just stopped moving on the other side of the plaster. The guest room grew colder. I measured the temperature once with a kitchen thermometer, 61 degrees, while the rest of the house maintained a comfortable 72. My wife suggested I see someone, a therapist perhaps, someone who could help me process the stress of the move and the lingering tensions in our relationship. She said this gently, holding my hand across the breakfast table, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Worry not for the house or the hidden room, but for me, for the husband who had begun to fray at the edges. I agreed to make an appointment. I didn't. Instead, I bought a stud finder and spent an entire Saturday running it along the hallway wall, mapping the internal structure with the obsessive precision of a cartographer charting unknown territory. The device beeped at regular intervals, indicating the wooden framing behind the plaster, until I reached the section of wall corresponding to the hidden space. There, the beeping became erratic, confused, as if the instrument couldn't quite determine what lay beyond. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. Breathing, slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. I jerked back so violently that I knocked a picture frame from the opposite wall, the glass shattering on the hardwood floor. My wife rushed upstairs to find me pale and shaking, unable to explain what I had heard without sounding completely unhinged. I told her I had slipped. She didn't believe me, but she was tired of asking questions that led nowhere. That night, I dreamed of a door. Not a real door. No hinges, no knob, just the outline of a door imprinted in the wallpaper of the hallway, visible only to me, pulsing faintly with a light that had no discernible source. In the dream, I pressed my palm against it and felt warmth, body heat, as if someone stood just on the other side, their hand mirroring mine, separated by less than an inch of plaster and wood. I woke, gasping, my wife's side of the bed empty. I found her in the kitchen, pouring coffee, the morning light harsh and ordinary. She asked if I was feeling any better. I told her I was. We both knew I was lying. The days that followed blurred into a haze of sleeplessness and mounting paranoia. I began to notice things I had previously overlooked, the way certain shadows fell at odd angles in the hallway, the persistent draft that seemed to emanate from the wall itself, the faint impressions in the carpet that suggested someone had been standing in the same spot, night after night, facing the hidden space. My own footprints, I told myself. My own nocturnal wanderings that I couldn't remember, but the footprints were smaller than mine, narrower, pressed into the carpet with a weight that my memory refused to account for. I stopped eating properly. I stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. My wife's concern hardened into something more distant, not quite fear, but a wariness that created invisible barriers between us. She started sleeping in the guest room, claiming that my tossing and turning kept her awake. I didn't argue. Part of me was relieved to have the bedroom to myself, to be able to watch the wall without explanation. One night, I took a hammer to the plaster. I didn't plan it. The decision emerged, fully formed, irresistible, a compulsion that bypassed reason entirely. I chose a spot midway down the hall, just above the baseboard, and swung. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing the wooden lath beneath, and beyond that, darkness. A darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed to be swallowed rather than illuminated. The smell hit me first. Not old paper this time, not stagnant water, but something organic, something alive. The musk of a body, the staleness of exhaled breath accumulated over years, decades, perhaps longer. I gagged, stepping back, the hammer slipping from my nerveless fingers. From within the darkness, I heard movement, not footsteps. Something slower, more deliberate, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the subtle displacement of air that accompanies physical presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I stood frozen in the hallway of my own home, staring into the hole I had made, watching as the darkness within seemed to shift and coalesce into something almost like a shape. And then my wife was there, shaking my shoulder, her voice sharp with alarm. She had heard the hammering from the guest room, had found me standing catatonic before the damaged wall. She didn't see the shape. She didn't smell the breath. She saw only her husband, hollow-eyed and trembling, clutching the evidence of his own deterioration. We patched the wall the next morning, she insisted. She said we would lose our security deposit, that the landlord would charge us for repairs, that I needed help, real help, the kind that came with prescriptions and regular appointments. I nodded along, agreeing to everything she said, watching from the corner of my eye as she spread spackle over the hole I had made. The wall looked whole again, unblemished. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to my wife's breathing in the guest room, I heard it. Not from behind the wall this time, but from somewhere closer. Somewhere inside the room with me. A voice. My own voice, impossibly, speaking words I couldn't quite understand, reciting something that sounded like a memory I had never lived. I sat up, heart hammering, and saw my reflection in the mirror across the room. Except my reflection wasn't sitting up. It remained lying down, eyes open, watching me with an expression of patient expectation. I must have blinked. I must have imagined it. When I looked again, the mirror showed only what it should. Me, sitting upright, pale and sweating, alone in a room that suddenly felt much too small. I haven't slept since then. I sit at the kitchen table through the night, drinking coffee that does nothing to sharpen my disintegrating focus, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. My wife has stopped asking if I'm okay. She watches me with something that might be pity, might be fear, might be the early stages of grief for a man who is disappearing by degrees. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the light is gray and uncertain, I hear footsteps in the hallway above me. Slow, measured, deliberate, pacing the length of wall that contains the hidden room, pausing at the spot where I made the hole, continuing on toward the guest room where my wife sleeps. I should go upstairs. I should check. I should confirm that there is nothing there, that my mind has simply fractured under the weight of its own obsession. But I know now that some spaces are hidden for a reason. I know that some things, once acknowledged, cannot be unseen. And I know, though I cannot explain how, that whatever lives between the walls has always been here, waiting with the patience of something that has nothing but time, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to finally let it out. This morning, I found the front door unlocked. Neither of us had opened it. When I asked my wife if she had heard anything during the night, she looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize. Blank, distant, as if she were listening to a voice I couldn't hear. She smiled. I've never seen that smile before, and I've begun to wonder if the thing in the walls needs a door at all, or if it has already found another way. Historia 8. The attic smelled of cedar and something older, something that reminded me of the back rooms of antique shops where dust settles on objects that haven't been touched in decades. My wife had insisted we clear it out before the winter storms arrived, and I'd agreed mostly to end the conversation. Now I sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that had belonged to their previous owners, an elderly couple who had passed the house down through generations before the estate sale brought it to us. She found the photographs in a leather case, the kind with brass clasps that had oxidized to a dull green. I remember the exact moment because of how the afternoon light caught her face through the small circular window, casting half of her features in amber and leaving the rest in shadow. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at whatever she held in her hands, and I watched her expression shift from curiosity to confusion to something I couldn't quite name. When she finally showed me the first photograph, I laughed. It was a nervous, reflexive sound that died in my throat almost immediately. The image was sepia-toned, its edges soft with age. A woman stood in front of what appeared to be a general store, her dress cinched at the waist in the fashion of the early 1940s, her hair set in careful waves beneath a small hat. The photograph's subject was looking directly at the camera with an expression of patient amusement, as if she knew something the photographer did not. The woman in the picture was my wife, not someone who resembled her, not a distant relative with similar features. It was her, the same slight asymmetry in her smile, the same way her left eyebrow arched higher than the right when she was thinking, the same small scar near her hairline from a childhood accident she'd told me about on our third date. The resemblance was not approximate, it was exact. My wife turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a date, August 1943. We found 11 more photographs that afternoon. Each one featured her, or the woman who could not possibly be her, in various settings across what appeared to be the same small town. Standing beside a man in military uniform, sitting on the steps of a white clapboard church, leaning against the hood of a car whose curved lines belonged to another era entirely. In every image, she wore different clothes but maintained the same unsettling awareness of the camera, the same half-smile that seemed to suggest a private understanding. My wife was born in 1987. Her mother was born in 1962. Her grandmother, whom I'd met twice before she passed, was born in 1938 and looked nothing like her. We didn't speak much that evening. She sat at the kitchen table with the photographs spread before her while I made dinner, both of us pretending that the clatter of pots and the hiss of the stove could fill the silence between us. When I finally asked if she was all right, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed focused on something just past my shoulder, and she said that she thought she recognized the church. She'd never been to this town before we bought the house. Neither of us had. The changes began gradually, so slowly that I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. She started waking before dawn, a habit she'd never had in the 8 years I'd known her. I would reach for her in the darkness and find only cooling sheets, and when I went to look for her, I would find her standing at one window or another, watching the street as if expecting someone. She began rearranging things, small objects at first. A vase moved 3 inches to the left, books reordered on shelves according to some system I couldn't discern, then larger changes. She insisted we move the bedroom furniture, claiming the arrangement felt wrong, though she couldn't explain what wrong meant. When I asked her about it, she would pause as if listening to something I couldn't hear, then shake her head and say she didn't know. It just wasn't right. The house began to feel different to me. I noticed it first in the hallways, which seemed longer in the evenings than they did during the day. Shadows gathered in corners where I didn't remember shadows gathering before. The floorboards creaked in patterns that sounded almost deliberate, almost like footsteps, though whenever I stopped to listen, the sound would stop as well, not fade, but cease entirely, as if whatever made it was waiting for me to move again. I told myself it was the season. Autumn had arrived with its early darkness and its cold winds that made the old house groan and settle. I told myself it was stress. We'd both been working too much, sleeping too little. I told myself many things in those first weeks, and I believed almost none of them. The photograph I found in my desk drawer was not one of the 11 we discovered in the attic. It showed the same woman, my wife, impossibly my wife, standing in what appeared to be the front yard of our house. Our house, unmistakably, with its wraparound porch and the distinctive crack in the second step that I'd been meaning to repair. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, wearing a dress that might have been navy blue before the photograph aged it to gray, and she was looking not at the camera, but at the upstairs window. The window of our bedroom. I hadn't put the photograph there. My wife claimed she hadn't either, and I believed her, though I couldn't say why. The photograph simply was, as if it had always been there, waiting in the darkness of that drawer until I was ready to find it. That night, I woke to the sound of my wife's voice. She was speaking softly, her words too low for me to understand, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her sitting at the edge of the bed with her back to me. The moonlight through the curtains painted her in silver and shadow, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second that stretched into something longer, I wasn't sure it was her at all. She was speaking to someone. I could see her gestures, the way she nodded as if in response to words I couldn't hear. When I said her name, she stopped. She turned to look at me, and in the pale light, her expression was one of confusion, as if she'd forgotten I was there. She told me she'd been dreaming, but she was awake. I'd watched her speak. I'd seen her nod. She told me she couldn't remember what she'd been saying. She told me she couldn't remember what she'd been dreaming about at all. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay in the darkness and listened to her breathing, and I tried not to think about the fact that her breathing sounded different somehow. The rhythm of it, the depth, as if she were learning how to do it again for the first time. The woman at the Historical Society was helpful, though her helpfulness led me somewhere I didn't want to go. I'd brought copies of the photographs, just 3 of them, the ones that showed enough background detail to be useful, and asked if she could identify the locations. She recognized the general store immediately. It had burned down in 1952, she told me, along with most of the town's main street. The church was easier. It still stood, though it had been converted into a private residence years ago. And the house in the 3rd photograph, the one that might have been ours, she said, had a history. A woman had lived there alone for many years. The locals had considered her odd, but harmless, a spinster who kept to herself and tended a garden that grew things no one could identify. She had disappeared in the winter of 1947, leaving behind all her possessions, including a leather case full of photographs. No one had ever found her. I asked the historian what the woman's name had been, but before she could answer, I told her I'd changed my mind. I didn't want to know. I thanked her and left, and I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, letting the wind fill the car with noise that drowned out the thoughts I didn't want to think. My wife was in the garden when I arrived. We'd never planted a garden. Neither of us had the interest or the skill. But there she was, kneeling in the dirt with her hands buried in the soil, pulling weeds from around plants I didn't recognize. I asked her what she was doing. She looked up at me with soil on her cheek and said she was tending her garden. Her garden, as if it had always been there, as if she had always tended it. I don't know how long I stood watching her before I noticed that the flowers she was cultivating were the same ones that appeared in one of the photographs. A dense cluster of pale blossoms with dark centers, growing in the exact same spot where they grew in an image taken 80 years before we were born. She doesn't sleep anymore. I know this because I no longer sleep either. Not really. I drift in and out of something that resembles unconsciousness, but lacks its mercy, and in those drifting hours I watch her. She stands at windows, she walks through the house in patterns that I've begun to map, tracing paths from room to room that never vary, never deviate. Sometimes she stops in the center of a doorway and simply waits, her head tilted as if listening, and then she moves on. I follow her when I can bear to, keeping my distance, watching her navigate rooms in perfect darkness as if she can see something I cannot. The photographs have multiplied. I find them in places I've already looked, places I've searched a dozen times. They appear in coat pockets and between the pages of books, tucked into the frames of mirrors and slipped beneath plates and cabinets. The woman in them, my wife, always my wife, ages through the collection, though she never seems to grow old. Her hair is longer in some, shorter in others. Her clothes span decades of fashion, but her face remains constant, untouched by time, preserved in the same expression of knowing patience. I've started to wonder if I'm losing my mind. The thought arrives each morning with the gray light through the curtains, and each morning I examine it from every angle, testing its edges like a loose tooth. Madness would be an explanation. Madness would make sense. Madness would mean that my wife is still my wife, that this house is just a house, that the photographs are nothing more than symptoms of a brain that has begun to fail in specific and elaborate ways. But then I see her face, and I know. I know because there are moments, brief fractures in the fabric of the ordinary, when she looks at me and I can see that she doesn't recognize me. Not that she's forgotten who I am, but that she's seeing me for the first time. Her eyes move over my features with the careful attention of someone cataloging a stranger, and in those moments, her expression holds neither love nor fear nor familiarity, only a vast and patient curiosity. And then it passes. She blinks, and she is my wife again, tired, confused, as frightened as I am by what is happening to us. She reaches for my hand, and I take it, and her fingers are cold, always so cold now, as if the warmth has begun to drain from her body, 1 degree at a time. Last night, I woke to find her standing over me. She was watching me sleep, her form silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. And she was smiling the smile from the photographs, the one that holds secrets, the one that suggests an understanding I cannot share. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. I tried to move, but my body refused. She leaned close. Her breath brushed my cheek, cold as the air in the attic, cold as the dust on the leather case, cold as something that has waited a very long time. She told me not to be afraid. She told me she'd been waiting. She told me things would be easier once I stopped resisting, once I accepted what I was beginning to understand. And then she kissed my forehead with lips that felt like paper, like parchment, like something preserved beyond its natural years. And she returned to her place beside me, and she closed her eyes, and I listened to her breathe in that strange new rhythm until the morning came. I am writing this in the study, in the thin gray light of another autumn afternoon. The house is quiet. My wife is in the garden again, tending plants that have no business surviving the approaching frost. Through the window, I can see her hands moving through the soil, and for just a moment, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, I see them differently. Older. Weathered by years I can't account for. I don't know who she is anymore. I don't know if she knows either. The leather case sits open on my desk, and I've arranged the photographs in chronological order, tracing the woman through the years she should not have lived. The last photograph in the sequence, the one I found this morning, tucked between the pages of our wedding album, shows her standing in this very room, beside this very desk, wearing a dress I don't recognize. She's not alone in the image. There's a man beside her, his features blurred by age and light, his hand resting on her shoulder with the casual intimacy of long familiarity. I've studied his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way he holds himself. I've compared him to the figure I see in our bathroom mirror each morning, the one whose face has grown haggard and whose eyes have developed new shadows. I can't tell if it's me. I can't tell if it's me yet. Outside, my wife has stopped working. She's standing now, looking at the house, looking at the window of the study where I sit. She's smiling that smile again, the one I see in every photograph, the one I'm beginning to see when I close my eyes. She raises one hand and waves, a small gesture, almost shy, and I find myself waving back before I can stop myself. The leather case has one slot left empty, room for one more photograph. I wonder whose face will fill it. I wonder if I already know. Historia Nueve. The first call came 3 weeks after we buried her. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the rain streaking down the window when the landline rang. That sound, that shrill, outdated trill, cut through the silence of the house like a scalpel. I hadn't heard it in months. The phone had belonged to my mother, an antique thing she refused to replace. Cream-colored plastic yellowed with age, a rotary dial that clicked and whirred like the joints of an arthritic hand. I'd brought it home after cleaning out her apartment, along with boxes of photographs I couldn't bring myself to open, and a cardigan that still smelled of her perfume, something floral and faintly medicinal. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. Static, the hiss and crackle of a connection struggling to hold. And then her voice, unmistakable, threading through the white noise like a whisper through fog. "Don't let him in." The line went dead. I stood there for what felt like hours, the receiver pressed against my ear, listening to the drone of the dial tone. My hands were trembling. I told myself it was a prank, some cruel joke orchestrated by someone who knew me, who knew what I'd lost. But even as I formed that thought, I felt the cold certainty settling in my chest that no one else had her voice. No one else could replicate that particular cadence, the slight rasp at the edges of her words. The way she always spoke as if she were sharing a secret meant only for me. I didn't sleep that night. The second call came 2 days later, at precisely 3:17 in the morning. I know the time because I'd been lying awake, watching the red digits of my alarm clock bleed into the darkness when the phone erupted from the living room. I walked down the hallway in my bare feet, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, and I noticed something that made me stop halfway. The air was wrong. It's difficult to explain. There was a thickness to it, a pressure against my skin, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The temperature had dropped, not dramatically, not enough to see my breath, but enough that I felt the cold seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt, settling into my bones. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. The floral perfume from her cardigan, mixed with something else. Something underneath. Damp earth. Wet stone. I answered the phone. "Don't let him in." The same words, the same voice. But this time I heard something in the background, a sound I couldn't identify at first, rhythmic and distant. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Breathing. Someone else was on the line, listening, their breath slow and deliberate, like a sleeper on the verge of waking. I hung up and unplugged the phone from the wall. The calls should have stopped. They didn't. The third night, I woke to the sound of ringing coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, feeling the vibration of each ring pulse through the house's bones, and I understood with horrible clarity that this wasn't something I could simply disconnect. The phone sat on the coffee table where I'd left it, cord coiled beside it like a dead snake, and yet it rang. I watched it ring. I watched the receiver tremble with each electronic scream, and I didn't answer. The ringing stopped after 17 minutes. I counted, but the silence that followed was worse. I began noticing things after that. Small things at first, the kind of details that slip past your attention unless you're looking for them. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed deeper, denser, as if they were gathering weight. The mirror in the bathroom showed my reflection a fraction of a second too late. I'd turn my head, and my image would hesitate before following, its eyes lingering on something just outside the frame. The photographs on the mantel, the ones I'd finally unpacked from my mother's boxes, kept shifting. Not moving, exactly, but rearranging. In one, she stood beside my father on their wedding day. The next morning, she stood alone. The space where he'd been nothing but a blur of overexposed light. I told myself I was tired. I told myself grief does strange things to the mind, that the brain, when starved of sleep and drowned in sorrow, begins to see patterns in chaos, meaning in randomness. I told myself these things because the alternative was too terrible to consider, but I couldn't explain the footprints. I found them on a Thursday morning, pressed into the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the basement stairs. They led down into the darkness below, and they were barefoot. The shape was wrong, the toes too long, the arch too pronounced, as if whatever had made them walked on feet not quite designed for walking. I stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand, and I listened. The basement was silent, but it was the silence of something waiting. I didn't go down. The calls continued. Every night, at 3:17, the phone would ring, and my mother's voice would crawl through the static with the same warning. Don't let him in. I stopped answering, but I could hear her anyway, the words seeping through the receiver even when I left it on the hook, bleeding into my dreams until I couldn't tell the difference between waking and sleeping. Who was he? I became obsessed with that question. I searched through my mother's belongings, looking for some clue, some reference to a person or presence that might explain the warning. I found nothing. Only old letters, yellowed receipts, the accumulated detritus of a life lived quietly and alone. But as I dug deeper, I began to notice gaps, missing photographs, torn pages in her journals, names scratched out with such violence that the pen had torn through the paper. Someone had been erased from her history, methodically and completely, and the absence left a shape I couldn't quite see. The feeling of being watched intensified. It started as a prickling at the back of my neck, a weight that pressed against my spine whenever I turned my back to a doorway. Then it evolved into something more specific, a certainty, bone deep and undeniable, that I was not alone in the house. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of something tall and thin disappearing around the corner. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just empty hallways and closed doors and the settling groans of an old house at night. I began sleeping with the lights on. Then I stopped sleeping altogether. My neighbor came by on a Saturday afternoon, concerned by the mail piling up in my box, and I barely recognized the man standing on my porch. He'd lived next door for 6 years, but his face seemed unfamiliar, his features sliding in and out of focus like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. He asked if I was all right, and I heard myself say yes, my voice sounding distant and mechanical, like a recording played back through a broken speaker. He looked past me into the house, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear, before he made an excuse and left. That night, I found the door to the basement standing open. I don't remember opening it. I don't remember going near it, but there it was, gaping like a wound in the wall. And from somewhere below came a sound that turned my blood to ice, my mother's voice singing. It was a lullaby she'd sung to me as a child, wordless and haunting, but the melody was wrong. The notes bent in impossible directions, rising and falling in patterns that no human throat should produce, and beneath the singing, I heard that breathing again. Slow, deliberate, patient. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, my heart hammering so violently I thought my ribs might crack. And then I heard it. 3 knocks. From the other side. Not frantic, not demanding, just 3 measured knocks, like someone politely requesting entry. The phone rang. I answered without thinking, my body moving on autopilot, my mind floating somewhere above, watching myself from a great distance. Don't let him in. A pause, a crackle of static, and then, for the first time, something different. He's been inside the whole time. The line went dead. I stood in the middle of my living room, the receiver hanging limp in my hand, and I understood with terrible clarity that I was no longer certain which side of the door I was standing on. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted while I wasn't looking, squeezing inward by imperceptible degrees. The shadows in the corners were darker than they should have been, and within them, I could almost see shapes, almost see movement. Almost see a figure, impossibly tall and thin, watching me with eyes I couldn't find. I haven't left the house in 11 days. I can't remember the last time I ate. The phone rings every night, but the voice has changed. It's still my mother, but there's something underneath it now. A second voice, deeper and older, speaking the same words in perfect synchronization. Don't let him in. A warning or a taunt, I can no longer tell. The footprints on the basement stairs have multiplied, climbing higher each morning, and the door at the bottom has started to open on its own. I've begun talking to myself, just to fill the silence. Sometimes I catch my reflection doing things I'm not doing, smiling when I'm not smiling, moving when I'm standing still. Sometimes I hear breathing in empty rooms, and I'm no longer certain if it's mine. Last night, I woke to find myself standing at the basement door, my hand on the knob, turning it slowly. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember walking down the hall. But I remember the cold that poured up from below, and I remember the voice. Not my mother's this time, but something that wore her voice like a mask, whispering from the darkness. "You already let him in." I looked down at my hands, and for just a moment, in the silver light of the moon through the window, they didn't look like my hands. The fingers were too long, the nails curved wrong, and when I brought them to my face, tracing the features I'd known my entire life, I felt something move beneath the skin. The phone is ringing again. I don't know if I should answer. I don't know if it matters anymore. The basement door is open, and I can hear singing from below, and somewhere in the darkness of this house that no longer feels like mine, something is waiting with terrible patience for me to understand what I've become, or perhaps what I've always been. My mother's voice echoes through the static, and I realize, with a horror that transcends fear, that I can no longer tell if the warning is for me or about me. The mirror across the room shows my reflection, standing perfectly still, but I'm not standing still. I'm walking toward it. Historias. The first time I heard the footsteps, I convinced myself it was the house settling. Old bones creak, I told my wife when she sat up in bed, her face pale against the darkness. Old bones creak, and we had just moved into a house built in 1947. The floorboards groaned with history, the walls whispered with decades of accumulated dust, and the ceiling, that low, yellowed ceiling that seemed to press down on us even in daylight. Surely it was just the rafters expanding and contracting with the November cold, but settling houses don't walk in patterns. They don't pace. The sound would begin around 3 a.m., always in the same sequence. 3 slow steps from somewhere above our bedroom, a pause that stretched into suffocating silence, then a shuffling drag toward the center of the house. My wife would grip my arm, her fingernails leaving crescents in my skin, and we would lie there together, barely breathing, listening to something move through a space that shouldn't exist. We lived in a single-story ranch. There was no upstairs. There was nothing above us but insulation, wooden beams, and 76 years of accumulated dust. I had checked the listing, reviewed the blueprints at the county office, measured every inch of the house myself. The attic was not a room. It was a crawl space at best, barely 3 feet of clearance between our ceiling and the pitched roof above. And yet, something walked there. Every night. While we lay frozen in our bed, pretending to sleep, pretending we couldn't hear the rhythmic creak of weight shifting from one foot to another directly above our heads. My wife stopped sleeping in our bedroom after the second week. She claimed the guest room was warmer, that the mattress agreed better with her back, that she simply needed space to stretch out. We both knew these were lies we told each other to avoid speaking the truth. She couldn't bear lying beneath those footsteps anymore. I didn't blame her. Some nights, when the walking grew particularly insistent, I could swear I felt the ceiling bow downward with each step, as if something heavy was testing the structural limits of our reality. But I refused to leave. Call it stubbornness, call it denial. I needed to believe there was a rational explanation. Raccoons in the attic, perhaps. Squirrels. Some animal had found its way in through a gap in the soffit and was nesting in our insulation. That's what I told myself as I lay awake, counting the footsteps, noting how they always stopped at the same spot, right above where my head rested on the pillow. I started sleeping with the lights on, then with the television on, then with both, the blue glow casting strange shadows across the ceiling while infomercials droned about miracle products that could fix anything except the impossible weight walking above me. The footsteps changed, or maybe I was simply learning to hear them better. What had once seemed like random pacing began to reveal a pattern. 3 steps, pause, shuffle, then a slow return to the starting point. Over and over, a loop that repeated until dawn began to gray the windows. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, the pattern would break. The footsteps would stop mid-stride, and something would happen that I could never quite explain to anyone, not even myself. It would knock. 3 deliberate taps on the ceiling, directly above my face, as if whatever walked up there knew exactly where I was, as if it was trying to get my attention. I bought the retractable attic ladder on a Saturday morning in early December. My wife found me in the hallway, staring up at the ceiling access panel that we'd both pretended didn't exist, and her face went the color of old bone. She asked me not to open it. Her voice cracked on the word open, and I saw in her eyes something I'd never seen before in 15 years of marriage. Genuine terror. Not fear, which is reasonable, which can be reasoned with. Terror, which is the body's animal recognition that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. I told her I needed to know. I needed to see the space with my own eyes, to prove to both of us that it was empty, that the sounds were just pipes or wind or our shared descent into some strange folie à deux. She left the house, said she'd be at her sister's, said she'd come back when I'd either found something or come to my senses. The way she slammed the door told me she hoped for neither. The ladder unfolded with a shriek of metal that set my teeth on edge. It was a cloudy afternoon, but enough gray light filtered through the windows to illuminate the rectangle of darkness above me. I had a flashlight. I had my phone. I had convinced myself that I was ready for whatever I might find up there. I was wrong. The smell hit me first, not the musty odor of old insulation I'd expected, but something else. Something organic. Like the back of a closet where clothes have been left damp for too long. That thick sweetness of slow decay that isn't quite rot, but suggests it. I covered my nose with my sleeve and climbed higher, my flashlight beam cutting through air that seemed too thick, too resistant. The attic was exactly as the blueprints had described, a cramped crawl space, perhaps 3 feet high at its peak, sloping down to nothing where the roof met the walls. Pink insulation lay in uneven patches between the joists. Ancient wiring snaked through the shadows. Everything was coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like gray snow, undisturbed and uniform, except for the footprints. They began at the far end of the attic, near a dark corner where my flashlight couldn't quite reach. Adult-sized impressions in the dust, bare feet by the look of them, each toe clearly visible. They led from that darkness toward the access panel where I crouched, and they were fresh. The edges were crisp, the dust disturbed in a way that couldn't have happened more than a few hours ago. I counted them as I followed the trail with my light. 14 footprints, leading directly to the spot above my bedroom. And there, in the dust, directly over where my pillow rested each night, the impressions changed. The feet had turned around, facing back toward that impenetrable corner. And between them, where knees would have been, 2 long oval depressions in the dust. Something had been kneeling there. Kneeling and looking down through the ceiling, looking at me. I descended the ladder so quickly I nearly fell. My hands shook as I folded it back up, and I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, staring at that ceiling panel, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't possible. Dust doesn't lie, but my eyes might. My mind might. I hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating properly. I was stressed about the house, about my wife's growing distance, about the way my life had begun to feel like something that was happening to someone else while I watched from very far away. I could have imagined the footprints. The mind, when pushed to its limits, is capable of extraordinary deception. But I couldn't have imagined the smell that began to seep through the ceiling that night. That same organic sweetness, now tinged with something sharper, something that made me think of old pennies and winter earth. I couldn't have imagined the new sound that joined the footsteps. A wet, rhythmic noise, like someone slowly, patiently, licking their lips. My wife returned 3 days later, and I didn't tell her what I'd found. I couldn't find the words that wouldn't make me sound insane, and part of me, the cowardly part, the part that wanted to return to the life we'd had before we bought this house, hoped that if I didn't speak the truth aloud, it would somehow become less real. We resumed our strange cohabitation, sleeping in separate rooms, avoiding the hallway where the access panel hung like a wound in the ceiling. The footsteps continued. Every night, 3 a.m., that same deliberate pattern. 3 steps, pause, shuffle, return. But now I knew what was making them. Now, when the footsteps stopped and the knocking began, I could picture exactly what was happening above me. Something was kneeling in the dark, pressing its hands to the ceiling, feeling for me through layers of drywall and plaster. I became obsessed with watching the attic access panel. I would sit in the hallway for hours, my eyes fixed on that rectangle of painted wood, waiting for it to move. It never did, but sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I would catch what looked like a subtle bulge, as if something was pressing down from the other side, testing the wood's resistance. When I looked directly at it, the surface was flat, normal. It was only in my peripheral vision that I could see the wrongness. My wife noticed the changes in me, the The weight I was losing, the gray that had begun to streak my hair, the way I would freeze mid-conversation, head cocked, listening for sounds she claimed not to hear. She begged me to see someone, a doctor, a therapist, anyone who might help. I agreed to appointments I had no intention of keeping. I smiled and nodded and told her I was fine, just tired, just adjusting to the new house. But I couldn't stop listening. And the more I listened, the more I heard. The footsteps weren't just above the bedroom anymore. They had begun to roam, tracing paths throughout the entire house, following me from room to room. When I sat in the kitchen, I heard them above the refrigerator. When I showered, they paced above the bathroom, back and forth, occasionally punctuated by that terrible wet sound. And at night, when I finally gave up on sleep and wandered the dark house like a ghost myself, the footsteps would stop wherever I stopped, start whenever I started, matching my movements with a precision that couldn't be coincidental. I went back up into the attic 3 more times. Each time, the footprints were different. Sometimes there were more of them. Sometimes they led to different parts of the crawl space. Once I found them clustered around a spot above the guest room where my wife now slept, and I nearly screamed before I clamped my hand over my mouth. The last time I went up, I brought a camera. I photographed everything. The footprints, the disturbed insulation, the dark corner where the trails always seemed to originate. When I downloaded the images to my computer, the files were corrupted, static in fragments. The only thing I could make out clearly was a section of that dark corner, and in the static, in the random noise of damaged data, I could almost see a shape. Something hunched, something waiting. I deleted the files. I told myself it was pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in chaos. I told myself a lot of things. It's February now. My wife has moved to her sister's indefinitely. She says she'll come back when I sell the house. We both know that's a lie too, one of many that have come to define what's left of our marriage. I don't blame her. I barely recognize myself in the mirror anymore. This gaunt, hollow-eyed creature that stares back at me, head always tilted toward the ceiling, always listening. The footsteps have stopped. That's the worst part. After 3 months of that relentless pacing, that maddening rhythm, the silence that fills my house now is somehow more terrifying than any sound could be. I lie awake in my bedroom, in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, and I wait for the walking to resume. I almost pray for it, because the walking meant whatever was up there was contained. The walking meant it was above me, separate from me, divided by drywall and insulation, and the fragile membrane of what I still called reality. The silence means something has changed. Last night, I woke to the sensation of being watched. Not the vague paranoia I've grown accustomed to, but something immediate, present, close. My room was cold, colder than it should have been, cold enough that I could see my breath clouding in the darkness. And in that cold, in that silence, I heard breathing, not my own. It was coming from directly beside my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't turn my head to look. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the slow, rhythmic rasp of air being drawn through lungs that sounded too large, too hollow. And I felt, or imagined I felt, the mattress dip slightly, as if something was leaning over me, bringing its face close to mine. The breathing continued for what might have been minutes or hours. Then it stopped. The cold receded, and in the morning light, I found a single footprint in the dust on my bedroom floor. It wasn't pointing toward the door. It was pointing toward the bed, toward the empty space beside me where my wife used to sleep. I've started sleeping with the lights on again, with the television on, with every door in the house locked and barricaded, though I know, that locks won't help. Whatever has been walking in my attic isn't something that needs doors. It's something that has been here all along, something that was waiting in this house for someone foolish enough to listen. And now that I've heard it, now that I've seen the proof of its existence pressed into 60 years of undisturbed dust, I don't think it's going to let me stop listening. 3 nights ago, I heard something new. Not footsteps, not breathing. A voice, thin and distant, coming from somewhere above the ceiling. It was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, a wet, clicking cadence that rose and fell like a prayer. And just before dawn, just as the gray light began to seep through my windows, the voice said something I recognized. It said my name. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I've been imagining everything. The footsteps, the prints, the presence beside my bed. Maybe this house is just a house, and I'm just a man who couldn't sleep, who let insomnia and isolation curdle into something like madness. I don't know anymore. That's the truth. I don't know what's real and what I've created out of fear and exhaustion. I don't know if something walks in my attic or only in the broken spaces of my mind. And when I go up the ladder tomorrow, because I will, I always do, I can't stop myself. I don't know what I'll find in the dust, but I know what I'll feel as I climb, the certainty that something is watching me from that dark corner, patient and still, waiting for the moment when I finally turn around and see its face. And I know that moment is coming soon. Historia once. The first time my wife mentioned the crying, we were eating dinner. November had settled over the house like a damp cloth, the kind of cold that seeps through window frames and pools and corners. She stopped mid-sentence, her fork hovering over a plate of food she'd barely touched for weeks, and tilted her head toward the ceiling. I asked what was wrong. She said she thought she heard something. Just the house settling, probably. Old bones creaking. We'd bought the Victorian 3 years before the pregnancy, before everything, drawn to its steep gables and wraparound porch. The way morning light fell through the stained glass transom above the front door. It was the kind of house that made you believe in futures. We had plans. We had a room at the end of the second-floor hallway that would become a nursery. Its walls eventually painted a soft yellow that reminded me of butter, of warmth, of small things growing. That room has been closed for 2 years now. I didn't hear anything that night at dinner, just the radiator ticking, the November wind testing the shutters. My wife returned to pushing food around her plate, and I told myself the sound she'd heard was nothing. A pipe, a draft, the particular acoustics of old houses playing tricks on ears that were still, perhaps, straining to hear something that would never come. But she heard it again the next night, and the night after that. The crying always began after dark. She described it as muffled at first, distant, like something heard through water or thick fabric. A newborn's cry, thin and wavering, with that distinctive rhythm of distress that evolution has hardwired into us to find unbearable. She said it seemed to come from inside the walls, traveling through the old horsehair plaster and wooden laths like a current through wire. I stayed up with her one night, sitting in the hallway outside the closed nursery door, listening. The house made its usual symphony of sounds. The refrigerator humming downstairs, something small scratching into the attic, the constant low moan of wind finding gaps in the century-old construction. But no crying, nothing that resembled what she'd described. She sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that unsettled me. Her hair had grown longer since we stopped trying, since the doctors explained in their careful clinical language why her body had rejected what we'd wanted so desperately. She looked thinner in the dim hallway light, the shadows collecting in the hollows of her cheeks. She insisted the crying was louder here, right here, outside this door. I suggested we open it, just look inside, turn on the light, prove that the room was empty except for the boxes we'd stored there, the crib we'd never assembled, the mobile of paper stars, the small folded clothes we couldn't bring ourselves to donate. She grabbed my arm with a force that surprised me. Her fingers were cold, pressing hard enough to leave marks I'd find later. "Not yet," she said. "I'm not ready." The following weeks brought a change I couldn't quite name. My wife began spending more time near that end of the hallway, finding reasons to linger. Adjusting a picture frame, testing the thermostat, simply standing there with her palm pressed flat against the closed nursery door as if feeling for a heartbeat. She stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake at 3, at 4 in the morning, and find the bed empty beside me, her pillow cold. I'd find her in the hallway, always the same position, back against the wall, head tilted, listening. She told me the crying was getting clearer. She could almost make out individual breaths now, the pattern of inhalation and wail that constituted a baby's language of need. I called her sister and asked if this was normal, if grief could crystallize into something like this after 2 years. Her sister said something about delayed processing, about the anniversary effects that could resurface trauma in unexpected ways. She used the phrase auditory hallucinations, gently, the way you'd touch a bruise. But my wife wasn't the only one noticing things. One evening, I found myself pausing outside the nursery door, keys still in hand from just getting home from work. I'd been walking past. I walk past that door every day. It's on the way to our bedroom. But something made me stop. Something in the quality of silence behind that door felt different, dense, expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm, charged with something about to happen. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard nothing, but I could feel my heart beating faster, and I could feel the cold radiating from the door itself, a deeper cold than the November chill could account for. The smell began in December. I noticed it first, a faint sweetness that didn't belong, threading through the usual old house odors of dust and aging wood. It reminded me of something I couldn't place, something soft and biological and innocent. My wife noticed it too, though she didn't mention it until I brought it up. Then her face changed in a way that frightened me. She said it smelled like a nursery, like baby powder and new skin, and that particular warmth of small bodies. The smell grew stronger near the closed door. I checked for dead animals in the walls, for mold, for anything that might produce an odor and could be explained away and fixed. I found nothing. The smell persisted, intensified, began drifting into the main hallway and down the stairs, and I started hearing things, not crying, not at first, but small sounds that seemed to come from just behind my range of perception. A rustle, a shift, something that might have been breathing if I let myself think about it that way. I heard them most clearly when I was alone in the house, when my wife was at work and I was trying to write at my desk and the afternoon light was fading into that gray winter dusk. The sounds always seemed to come from upstairs, from the end of the hallway. I opened the door in mid-December. I didn't tell my wife. She was at a doctor's appointment, something routine, and I found myself standing in front of that door with my hand on the knob as if someone else had guided me there. The wood felt warm under my palm. I remember thinking that was wrong. The door had always been cold, radiating winter chill from the unheated room beyond, but now it was warm, almost feverish, like touching living skin. The room inside was exactly as we'd left it. Cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, labeled in my wife's handwriting. The yellow paint that had been cheerful once now looked jaundiced in the weak light from the single window. Dust motes floated in the air, undisturbed, but the air itself felt wrong, thick somehow, resistant, like walking into water. And the smell was overwhelming here, that sweet baby smell, so concentrated it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at each wall, at the corners, at the ceiling where water stains made brown archipelagos on the plaster. I was looking for something that wasn't there. I was waiting for something that didn't come. Then I noticed the wallpaper. We hadn't put up wallpaper. The walls were painted. I remembered painting them myself. 2 coats of that butter yellow over primer, my wife supervising with one hand resting on her belly. But now, in one corner, I could see wallpaper peeling back from the plaster. A pattern of small animals, lambs and rabbits, the kind of thing you'd choose for a nursery. I had never seen it before. We had never put it there. I left the room quickly, closed the door, and didn't mention any of this to my wife. But she knew. Something changed after that day. She looked at me differently, her eyes following me with an expression I couldn't interpret. She asked if I'd been in the room. She said she could tell. She could feel that someone had been inside, had disturbed something. The way she said it made the hair on my arm stand up. The crying grew louder that week, loud enough that I heard it too, unmistakable now, threading through the walls at odd hours, following us downstairs, filling the kitchen while we ate our silent dinners. It sounded real. It sounded hungry and frightened and desperately alone, the way all newborns sound, the way ours might have sounded if things had been different. My wife said the crying came from everywhere now, from inside the walls, from the floor beneath our bed, from the crawl space under the house. She said it was looking for something. She said she needed to answer it. I found her one night at 3 a.m, standing inside the nursery. The door was open. I hadn't heard her get up, hadn't heard the hinges creak. She was just there, in her nightgown, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, standing perfectly still with her arms curved in front of her chest as if she were holding something. She was humming a lullaby. I said her name. She didn't respond. I stepped into the room and felt it. The thickness in the air had increased, had become almost solid, and there was a pressure against my chest like invisible hands pushing me back. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water, and I heard the crying, clear now, unmuffled, coming from all around us, from inside the walls and beneath the floor and from somewhere within my wife's curved arms. The sound of an infant screaming for comfort, for food, for the warmth of another body. A sound that shouldn't exist. A sound that had been waiting for 2 years behind a closed door, growing stronger, growing more desperate, learning how to call to us. My wife turned to look at me. Her face was serene, beatific, the face of a woman who has finally gotten what she wanted. She said something to me then, her voice barely audible over the crying that filled the room like water filling a drowning lung. She said, Can't you hear our baby? It wants us to stay. I don't go upstairs anymore. I sleep on the couch in the living room, waking every few hours to the sound of footsteps above me, to lullabies hummed in my wife's voice, to crying that grows louder each night. The smell has spread through the whole house now. That terrible, sweet nursery smell. And sometimes I think I can see things moving in my peripheral vision. Small shapes, low to the ground, quick as shadows. My wife spends all her time in that room. She speaks to me less and less, and when she does, her words don't always make sense. She talks about feeding schedules and sleep patterns and the particular way our baby likes to be held. She tells me I should come upstairs, that I'm missing everything, that the baby wants to meet its father. I've tried to leave. I've packed bags, put on my coat, walked to the front door with my car keys in my hand, but every time I hear the crying grow louder, more desperate, and I feel something in my chest that might be grief, or might be guilt, or might be something else entirely. Something planted there, growing, taking root. I find myself walking toward the stairs. I find myself standing at the bottom, looking up into the darkness of the second floor, listening to the lullabies, breathing in that sweet, awful smell. I'm beginning to understand what my wife means when she says the baby is hungry. I'm beginning to understand that it's been waiting for both of us. Last night, I pressed my palm against the wall beside the staircase, and I felt something press back. Something small. Something warm. Something that had learned patience over 2 long years, growing in the dark spaces between plaster and lath, feeding on longing, waiting for its parents to finally come home. I don't know anymore if the crying is real. I don't know if anything is real. The smell, the wallpaper, my wife's curved arms cradling empty air. I only know that I am very tired, and the stairs are right there, and somewhere above me, something that sounds like an infant is calling my name in a voice I almost recognize. It sounds like forgiveness. It sounds like forever. Tonight, I think I might go upstairs. Historia dotes. The box didn't belong to us. I noticed it immediately when we finished unloading the truck, a cardboard cube sitting in the corner of what would become the living room, its surface bloated with moisture damage and covered in a fine layer of grime that suggested years, perhaps decades, of neglect. My wife stood beside me, wiping sweat from her forehead, and when I pointed at it, she simply shrugged. Neither of us had packed it. Neither of us had carried it inside. The house itself already unsettled me in ways I couldn't articulate. A Victorian-era structure at the end of a cul-de-sac, purchased for a price that should have raised more questions than it did. The real estate agent had been vague about its history, and the neighbors, those we'd glimpsed through curtains, seemed to watch our arrival with an intensity that felt more like vigil than curiosity. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost conversational, as if the house were speaking in a language just beyond comprehension. But it was the box that demanded attention. I opened it alone, after my wife had gone upstairs to arrange the bedroom. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from a year I couldn't identify, was a porcelain doll. Female, approximately 18 inches tall, dressed in a Victorian-era gown of faded burgundy velvet. Her face was cracked along the left cheek, a hairline fracture that ran from the corner of her painted smile to the hollow socket of her missing left eye. The remaining eye, a pale, clouded blue, seemed to track me as I lifted her from the box. I felt an immediate revulsion, a visceral wrongness that started in my stomach and radiated outward. The doll was cold in my hands, colder than the ambient temperature of the room could explain, and there was a smell emanating from her, something sweet and rotting, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I threw her away that same night, walked her out to the garbage bins at the end of the driveway, lifted the lid, and dropped her inside without ceremony. The lid slammed shut with a finality that should have ended things. It didn't. 3 days later, I found her in the kitchen. She was sitting on the counter beside the coffee maker, positioned as if someone had placed her there with care. Her single eye faced the doorway, faced me, and I stood frozen in the threshold for what felt like minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I could feel it in my teeth. My wife was still asleep. I checked, climbed the stairs quietly, and found her beneath the covers, breathing steadily, undisturbed. When I came back down, the doll remained exactly where I'd found her. I told myself there was an explanation. Perhaps I hadn't actually thrown her away. Perhaps I'd only intended to and then forgotten, my memory rewriting itself in the chaos of the move. Stress does strange things to the mind, sleep deprivation even stranger. I'd been averaging 4 hours a night since we arrived, my dreams invaded by formless shapes that whispered from corners I couldn't see. I threw her away again, drove 3 miles to a dumpster behind a strip mall and buried her beneath bags of restaurant waste. I watched the garbage truck come the next morning, watched it compact everything inside with hydraulic finality. She appeared in the hallway closet 2 days later, closer now, the hallway that led to the stairs, to the bedrooms. The house began to change after that, or perhaps my perception of it changed. I could no longer tell the difference, and the uncertainty gnawed at me like something alive. Shadows pooled in corners that should have been illuminated. The temperature dropped in specific rooms at specific times, always when I was alone, always accompanied by that sweet rot smell that I now associated exclusively with the doll. I didn't tell my wife. She was adapting to the house with an ease that I found increasingly alien, humming as she unpacked boxes, commenting on the beautiful morning light that streamed through windows I found perpetually dim. When I mentioned the smell, she tilted her head and inhaled deeply, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. She said she didn't smell anything. I started sleeping poorly, then barely at all. I would lie awake listening to the house settle, hearing footsteps in the hallway that stopped just outside our bedroom door. Once, I gathered the courage to open it, to confront whatever stood on the other side. The hallway was empty, but the carpet showed impressions, small, circular marks, like the feet of a doll, leading from the staircase to our threshold. I didn't tell my wife about that either. The third time I disposed of the doll, I burned her. I built a fire in the backyard, in a pit I dug with my own hands, and I placed her in the center of the flames. I watched the velvet blacken and curl. I watched the porcelain crack and split. I stayed until there was nothing left but ash and fragments, and then I buried those fragments 6 inches deep and covered the ground with stones. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks, a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like mercy. I woke at 3:47 a.m. to find her sitting on my wife's dresser. She was whole, undamaged. The crack on her cheek was gone, her missing eye restored. Both eyes now that pale, clouded blue, both eyes fixed on me in the darkness. She was inside our bedroom. She had crossed a threshold that felt sacred, violated a space that should have been safe. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice had abandoned me, retreated somewhere deep inside where the terror couldn't reach. I simply stared at her, and she stared back. And in that moment, I understood something terrible. She wasn't coming for me. She was coming home. I became obsessed with understanding. I spent days researching the house's history, the previous owners, any incident that might explain the doll's existence. The internet yielded nothing. Public records showed the house had been vacant for 7 years before our purchase, and the owner before that had been a corporation, faceless, untraceable. I visited the local library and found the archives unhelpful, the librarian evasive, her eyes darting toward the door whenever I mentioned the address. She told me some houses are best left alone. She said it like a warning, or perhaps a confession. I stopped disposing of the doll. Instead, I moved her, placed her in different rooms, tested whether her migration pattern would continue if I was the one controlling her position. I put her in the garage, as far from the bedrooms as possible, and locked the door with a padlock I purchased specifically for this purpose. She was in the guest bathroom the next morning. Closer, I put her in the basement, surrounded by salt that I'd read somewhere could contain supernatural entities. Superstition, I knew, but I was beyond rationality. I was operating on instinct now, on fear. She appeared in the upstairs hallway closet, closer still. My wife asked me why I looked so tired. She asked me why I flinched at sounds she couldn't hear. She asked me why I spent hours staring at corners, why I wouldn't enter certain rooms, why I slept with the lights on and still woke screaming. I told her about the doll. She listened patiently, her expression neutral, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the hallway closet and opened the door. She said there was nothing there. I pushed past her and looked for myself. The closet was empty. Coats hung on their hangers, shoes lined up on the floor, but no doll. No porcelain face, no burgundy velvet, no pale blue eyes watching from the darkness. I checked every room, every closet, every cabinet and drawer and space where something small could hide. The doll was gone, vanished as if she'd never existed. My wife suggested I see someone, a professional. She used gentle words, careful phrases, but I understood what she meant. She thought I was losing my mind. Perhaps I was. Perhaps I had been losing it since we arrived. The stress of the move manifesting in hallucinations so vivid I couldn't distinguish them from reality. I agreed to make an appointment. I apologized for frightening her. I went to bed early and told myself that it was over. that the doll had been a symptom, and now that I'd acknowledged it, the symptom would fade. I woke in the middle of the night to absolute darkness. The power had gone out, or perhaps I'd simply forgotten to leave the lights on. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and found something else instead. Cold porcelain, smooth fabric, the shape of a small hand. She was on my nightstand, inches from my face, close enough that when I turned my head, I could see her silhouette in the faint moonlight bleeding through the curtains. She was facing me. She was waiting. I lay perfectly still, my breath trapped in my lungs, my heart beating so loudly I was certain my wife would wake. But my wife didn't stir. My wife slept peacefully beside me, her back turned, her breathing steady and slow. I reached out and touched the doll. She was warm now, warm as living flesh, warm as something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. I lifted her, felt her weight in my hands, and something shifted inside me. Some understanding that I had been fighting for weeks finally clicked into place. The doll wasn't haunting the house. The doll lived here. She had always lived here. We were the intruders. We were the ones who didn't belong. I carried her downstairs in the darkness, moving through rooms I could no longer see, but somehow knew by feel. I placed her on the mantel above the fireplace, a position of honor, a position of belonging, and I stepped back. The house sighed around me, a settling sound, like satisfaction. When I returned to bed, my wife was sitting up, watching me with eyes I couldn't see clearly in the darkness. She asked me where I had gone. I told her I just needed some water. She accepted this, lay back down, and was asleep within minutes. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the house breathe, feeling the presence that had always been here long before us, watching the doorway from movement that never came. The doll hasn't moved since. She sits on the mantel, her eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for something I don't want to understand. Sometimes I catch my wife standing in front of her, staring, her lips moving slightly as if in conversation. When I ask what she's doing, she smiles and says nothing. Just looking, she tells me. Just looking. I don't believe her. I don't believe any of this. I don't believe the doll is real, or that the house is alive, or that something ancient and patient has been waiting for us to arrive. But I don't move her either. I don't touch her. I don't even look at her directly anymore, because sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I see her head turn. Just slightly, just enough to track me as I pass. And last night, for the first time, I could have sworn she smiled. Historia tres. The feeling always starts the same way. A slow creep of awareness that pulls me from sleep like fingers dragging across the surface of still water. Not sudden. Never sudden. It seeps in through the edges of unconsciousness, a wrongness that settles into my bones before my mind can name it. Tonight is no different. My eyes open to darkness, and I know, with the certainty of a man who has lived this moment hundreds of times before, that something is watching me. I lie perfectly still beneath the thin sheet, my breath shallow and measured. The apartment is quiet save for the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional groan of pipes behind the walls, sounds I have memorized over the 18 months I've lived here. But there is another sound now, or perhaps the absence of sound, a pressure in the air that makes my ears strain toward the window. The curtains are drawn, heavy fabric that my wife insisted on buying when we moved in. She said they would help me sleep. She didn't know then what I was beginning to suspect now, that sleep has become the enemy, and the curtains are merely a veil between me and whatever waits on the other side. 5 floors up. That's what I tell myself every night. 5 floors above the street, above the reach of anyone or anything that might want to peer inside. The building across from ours is shorter by 2 stories, its rooftop nothing but a flat expanse of tar paper and ventilation units. No one could be at my window. The mathematics of it should be comforting. The height, the distance, the sheer impossibility of a face appearing at glass that opens onto nothing but empty air. And yet, the sensation persists. It has persisted for 7 weeks now, growing stronger with each passing night. At first, I convinced myself it was stress. The promotion at work had come with expectations I wasn't certain I could meet, and the long hours had worn grooves into my psyche that left me vulnerable to night terrors and paranoid fantasies. My wife noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I started at unexpected sounds, the habit I developed of checking the locks 3 times before bed. She suggested I see someone, a professional who could untangle whatever knots had formed in my mind. I made an appointment. Then I canceled it. Then I made another. The date sits on my calendar like a threat, 3 weeks away.
An admission of weakness I am not yet prepared to make. The clock on the nightstand reads 3:17 a.m., the same time, or close to it, as every other night. I have started tracking the awakenings in a notebook I keep hidden in my desk at work, pages filled with timestamps and observations written in handwriting that grows more erratic with each entry. 3:14, 3:19, 3:17, 3:15. The pattern, if there is one, eludes me. What doesn't elude me is the consistency of the sensation, that crawling awareness of eyes that aren't there, fixed on me through layers of glass and fabric. Tonight, I will look. The decision forms before I can talk myself out of it, crystallizing in my chest like ice. For 7 weeks, I have lain in this bed with my back to the window, my eyes squeezed shut, my body rigid with a terror I can neither explain nor escape. For 7 weeks, I have waited for dawn to dissolve the dread, only to spend each day in a fog of exhaustion and creeping doubt. My wife has stopped asking what's wrong. The silence between us has grown thick enough to touch, and I have caught her watching me with an expression I cannot name, concern, perhaps, or something closer to fear. She sleeps beside me now, her breathing deep and even, oblivious to the war I am fighting against my own sanity. I rise slowly, careful not to disturb her, and the mattress shifts beneath me with a sound that seems impossibly loud in the darkness. My feet find the cold hardwood floor, and I stand there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. The room takes shape around me, the dresser against the far wall, the chair in the corner where I've been leaving my clothes instead of hanging them up, the closet door that I make certain to close it every night because something about its darkness feels wrong when it stands open. Everything is exactly as it should be, and yet, the window pulls at me like a physical force. I can feel it behind me, a rectangular void in the wall that seems to breathe with its own alien rhythm. My heart hammers against my ribs as I turn, slowly, to face it. The curtains hang motionless. No breeze, no movement, nothing to suggest anything other than an ordinary night in an ordinary apartment 5 floors above an ordinary street. I take a step forward, then another. The distance between me and the window shrinks with each heartbeat until I'm close enough to touch the fabric. It feels wrong beneath my fingers, too warm, as though something has been pressed against it from the other side, transferring heat through the weave. The rational part of my mind scrambles for explanations. The heating vent is nearby. The curtains trap warmth. There is nothing on the other side but air and the distant lights of the city. I pull the curtain aside. The face is there. It is pressed against the glass so tightly that the features have flattened, distorted by the pressure into something that might have been human once, but now exists in a space between recognition and nightmare. The skin is pale, not the pallor of illness, but the absolute white of something that has never known sunlight, stretched taut over bones that seem too sharp, too angular. The eyes are open, fixed on mine with an intensity that stops my breath in my throat. They do not blink. They do not move. They simply watch, and in their watching, I feel something essential inside me begin to fracture. I cannot scream. The sound rises in my chest and dies somewhere in my throat, strangled by a terror so complete that my body has forgotten how to function. I stand there, frozen, my hand still gripping the curtain, and the face stares back at me through the glass. It is smiling. The expression is wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the lips pulled back to reveal teeth that are too numerous, too uniform, too white. It is a smile without warmth, without humanity, a mimicry of emotion that only emphasizes the wrongness of what I am seeing. And then it moves. The movement is subtle at first, a slight tilting of the head, like a curious animal examining something it doesn't quite understand. But the motion is wrong, too smooth, lacking the tiny hesitations and adjustments that characterize living things. It moves the way a reflection might move if the reflection were somehow separate from its source, governed by rules that exist outside the world I know. I release the curtain. It falls back into place, severing my view of the thing outside, and I stumble backward until my legs hit the edge of the bed. My wife stirs but does not wake, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into stillness. I want to wake her. I need to wake her, to have her see what I have seen, to confirm that I am not losing my mind in some spectacular and terrifying way. But when I reach for her shoulder, my hand stops inches from her skin. What if she doesn't see it? The thought paralyzes me. If I wake her and she pulls back the curtain and finds nothing but empty air and distant city lights, what then? The appointment with the professional suddenly feels less like a threat and more like an inevitability.
I will become a patient, a case study, a man who sees faces in windows 5 floors above the ground. My wife will look at me differently, is already looking at me differently. I realize now because some part of her has already sensed what is happening to me, even if neither of us has words for it yet. I do not pull the curtain aside again. I return to bed, my back to the window, my eyes fixed on the wall opposite, and I wait for dawn. The sensation of being watched does not fade. If anything, it intensifies, a pressure against the back of my skull that makes my skin crawl and my thoughts scatter into fragments that refuse to coalesce into meaning. I tell myself that I imagined it. I tell myself that stress and exhaustion have finally conspired to break something in my brain, that the face was nothing more than a projection of my own fear given shape by a mind desperate for sleep. I almost believe it. The next morning, my wife mentions that I was talking in my sleep. Not words she could understand, she says, but sounds, low and rhythmic, like someone reciting something in a language she didn't recognize. She laughs when she tells me, but her eyes are worried, and I catch her glancing at the window when she thinks I'm not looking. That night, I wake at 3:14. The feeling is there, stronger than before. I do not look. The night after, I wake at 3:18. I do not look. But on the third night, I find myself standing at the window with no memory of having gotten out of bed. The curtain is in my hand. The glass is cold against my other palm, pressed flat against it as though I have been trying to reach through to the other side. And beyond the glass, in the darkness that should contain nothing but air and distance and the mundane geometry of an ordinary city night, I see movement. Not the face, not this time. Something else. Something that shifts at the edges of my vision, too fast and too fluid to resolve into shape, circling the building in patterns that seem almost purposeful. I watch it for what feels like hours but might only be minutes, tracking its movement through the sky with eyes that have begun to ache from the strain of seeing what should not be there. When dawn finally comes, I find a handprint on the outside of the glass. The fingers are too long, the palm is too narrow, and the angle is wrong, tilted as though whatever left it was hanging upside down, suspended in the air 5 floors above the street, pressing its palm against my window while I slept. My wife notices it while making coffee. She frowns, mentions that the window cleaners must have come, though neither of us can remember scheduling an appointment. She doesn't look at it closely. She doesn't count the fingers the way I do later, after she's left for work, standing at the window in the gray morning light with my breath fogging the glass. 6 fingers. The handprint has 6 fingers. I cancel the appointment with the professional. Not because I think I'm sane. I'm no longer certain sanity is a concept that applies to whatever I've become, but because I'm beginning to suspect that what's happening to me exists outside the framework of psychology and treatment and the comfortable fictions we tell ourselves about the nature of reality. Something has noticed me. Something has been watching me for 7 weeks, waiting for me to look back, and now that I have, I can feel it settling into the spaces behind my thoughts like a second consciousness taking up residence in my skull. My wife has started sleeping in the guest room. She says my restlessness keeps her awake, but I see the way she looks at me now, the way her gaze slides past mine when I try to meet her eyes. She knows something is wrong. She just doesn't know what. Neither do I. Not really, though I'm beginning to develop theories that I dare not speak aloud for fear of making them true. The handprints appear every morning now. Sometimes on the window, sometimes on the bathroom mirror. Once, I found one on the inside of the closet door. The closet I make it certain to close every night because something about its darkness feels wrong when it stands open. The fingers are always too long. The palms are always too narrow. And the angle is always wrong, as though whatever leaves them exists in a space where up and down are merely suggestions, where gravity is a courtesy extended only to those who deserve it. I have stopped sleeping. The awakenings have become irrelevant because I no longer close my eyes long enough to experience them. I sit in the chair by the window instead, watching the city lights blur and shift through glass that has become a membrane between my world and something else, something that presses against reality with the patience of a creature that has learned to wait. Tonight, I pulled back the curtain and the face was there again. Closer this time, close enough that if the glass weren't between us, its breath would have touched my skin. It was smiling with that too wide mouth, those too numerous teeth, and as I watched, it lifted one hand and pressed it against the window. 6 fingers, the palm too narrow, the angle wrong. But this time, I noticed something else, something that has haunted me through the gray hours of morning and will haunt me, I suspect, for whatever time I have left. The face was familiar. The distortion made it hard to see at first, The way the glass flattened and stretched the features into something nightmarish. But beneath the wrongness, beneath the pallor and the impossible smile and the eyes that don't blink, there is a structure I recognize. It's my face pressed against the glass from the outside, 5 floors above the ground, watching me with eyes that have learned to see in directions I cannot name. I'm writing this now because I need a record. I need someone to know what happened, even if they don't believe it, even if they read these words and see nothing but the ravings of a man who finally broke under the weight of his own delusions. My wife is in the guest room, the apartment is quiet, and the window behind me is dark, but I can feel the pressure of eyes against my back, the weight of attention from something that has been waiting for me to understand. I think I understand now. I think I've always been watching myself. I think the thing at the window is what I'm becoming, or what I've always been, or what exists in the space between the two. A version of me that slipped loose from the constraints of a reality too small to contain it. The curtain is moving. There's no breeze. I think I'll look. Historia torch. The house smelled wrong, not the mustiness I expected from a place shut tight for 3 weeks since my grandfather's passing, nor the chemical sting of cleaning products left behind by the estate company. This was something underneath those smells, something older, like copper and wet stone, and the faint sweetness of decay that clings to forgotten fruit cellars. I stood in the doorway with my single suitcase, breathing through my mouth, and told myself it was nothing. Old houses have old smells, that's all. The attorney had handed me the keys with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, certainly, but something else flickered behind his eyes when he mentioned the property. He'd called it substantial, which I'd taken to mean valuable. Now, stepping across the threshold into the dim foyer, I understood he'd meant something different entirely. The house was substantial the way a tumor is substantial. It had presence, weight, a kind of malignant gravity that pulled at the edges of my perception. I hadn't been here since I was 19, nearly 15 years ago. My grandfather and I had argued about something I can no longer remember, and pride had kept me away. Pride and, if I'm honest, a feeling I'd never admitted to anyone. The house had always watched me. Even as a boy visiting during summers, I'd felt eyes tracking my movements through hallways, attention pressing against my back when I climbed the stairs. My grandmother had passed when I was 12, and afterward, the watching had grown more intense, more focused. I'd been relieved when my anger gave me an excuse to stop visiting. Now I was back, and I was the owner, and the watching had already begun again. I spent the first day simply walking through rooms, reacquainting myself with the layout. The house was a Victorian sprawl, added onto haphazardly over generations until it had become a maze of unexpected corners and rooms that seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. I'd enter a bedroom through one door and find myself unable to locate that same door when I tried to leave. Hallways extended longer than they should have, given the exterior dimensions. Twice I passed the same grandfather clock in different rooms, though I was certain there was only one. By evening, I'd unpacked in what had been my grandfather's bedroom. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the guest room I'd used as a child, with its window that faced the oak tree whose branches had always seemed to reach for the glass with too much intention. The master bedroom felt safer, though I couldn't say why. Perhaps because my grandfather had survived here for 87 years. Whatever watched this house had let him live. It was on my 3rd night, unable to sleep and wandering the lower floors at an hour so late it had become early, that I found the study's hidden compartment. I'd been examining the bookshelves, pulling out leather-bound volumes that crumbled at my touch, when my fingers caught on something behind a row of encyclopedias, a small brass lever, corroded green with age. When I pulled it, a section of the wall clicked open, revealing a space barely large enough to hold what it contained, a single book, bound in something that might have been leather but felt too soft, too yielding when I touched it. The diary, I knew immediately that's what it was, seemed to hum against my palms as I carried it to the desk. The lamp flickered when I opened it, and I told myself it was old wiring, just old wiring. The first entry was dated 1887. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and the ink had faded to a pale brown that was difficult to read in the uncertain light. A woman's name appeared at the top of the page, followed by 2 dates, a birth date and another date marked with a small symbol I didn't recognize. Below that, a single line. She came to us on the winter solstice. The house has chosen. I turned pages. More names, more paired dates. The handwriting changed as decades passed, sometimes masculine, sometimes feminine, sometimes shaky with age or illness. The format remained consistent. Name, birth date, that second marked date, and a brief notation. The house has chosen. The house provides. The house requires. Around 2 a.m., with my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the pages, I found my grandfather's entry. His name, his birth date, and the second date, the exact date of his death, 3 weeks ago, written in handwriting that predated his birth by 40 years. I almost stopped then, almost slammed the book shut and burned it in the fireplace and never thought about it again. But the pages turned themselves, I swear they turned themselves, to an entry near the back of the book. My name, my birth date, and a date 3 months from now, marked with that same small symbol. The lamp went out. In the darkness, I heard something move in the walls, not the scurrying of mice or the settling of old timbers, but a sound like breathing, like slow and patient exhalation from a throat too large to belong to anything that should exist. I don't remember getting back to the bedroom. I woke at noon with the diary clutched to my chest and a bruise on my forehead that might have come from a fall or might have come from something else entirely. I should have left. I know that now, and I knew it then. But the diary had done something to me, planted a hook somewhere behind my eyes that pulled my attention back to it whenever I tried to look away. I began reading more carefully, comparing the death dates to historical records I found in boxes of family documents. Every date was accurate, every single one, going back over 130 years. My wife called on the 5th day. I told her I needed a week to sort through the estate, but she said my voice sounded strange and asked if I was eating properly. I told her I was fine. I told her the house was just quiet and old and I missed her. I didn't tell her about the diary. I didn't tell her about the way the shadows had started to move wrong, pooling in corners where no darkness should gather, stretching toward me across floors when the afternoon sun should have banished them entirely. I didn't tell her that I'd begun to hear my name whispered in empty rooms. The sound came at odd hours, never when I was looking for it, always when my mind was occupied with something else. I'd be making coffee and hear it from the hallway. I'd be showering and hear it through the bathroom door. A whisper that might have been the wind through old window frames, might have been pipes settling, might have been the house speaking my name with a voice like dust and hunger. By the second week, I'd stopped leaving the property. The town was only 3 miles away, but the road leading from the house had begun to feel wrong, as though it curved back on itself when I wasn't looking. Twice I drove toward town and ended up back in the driveway, though I couldn't remember turning around. The third time, I saw something standing in the tree line at the edge of the property, a figure that was too tall and too thin and held itself at angles that human joints shouldn't allow. I didn't try driving again after that. My wife stopped calling. No, that's not right. I stopped answering. Her voice had begun to sound different through the phone, distorted in ways that made my skin crawl. Once, when I did answer, the voice on the other end used her words but spoke in a rhythm that wasn't hers, with pauses in the wrong places and emphasis on syllables that shouldn't have been stressed. I hung up and unplugged every phone in the house. The diary demanded my attention now. I spent hours each day tracing the genealogy it contained, mapping the connections between names, noting patterns I couldn't quite understand. Every entry included that same phrase, "The house has chosen," and I began to wonder what that choosing meant. The entries never described deaths, never mentioned illness or accident. They simply recorded names and dates with the certainty of a ledger tracking accounts receivable. I found my grandfather's handwriting near the middle of the book, adding entries that spanned 50 years. His script was precise, untroubled, the writing of a man who understood and accepted his role in something larger than himself. In the margins of several pages, he'd added notes. "She's hungry again," and "The walls are thin tonight," and, on one page dated 30 years ago, "I've seen what lives in the basement and I am not afraid. I haven't been to the basement. I won't go to the basement." The door at the end of the kitchen hallway has begun to sweat a dark moisture that pools on the floor, and when I press my ear against the wood, I hear something moving down there, something large, something patient, something that breathes in the same rhythm as the whispers that speak my name. It's been 2 months now. 1 month remains until the date marked in the diary. I've begun to notice changes in myself. My reflection moves a half-second too slow when I pass mirrors, and sometimes its expression doesn't match my own. It smiles when I'm not smiling, tilts its head when I'm holding still. My hands have developed a tremor that worsens at night. I've lost weight. My clothes hang loose on a frame that feels less substantial each day, as though the house is slowly drinking something essential from my body. But here's what frightens me most. I don't want to leave anymore. The fear is still there, coiled in my chest like a living thing, but alongside it has grown a terrible acceptance. My grandfather lived here for 60 years after his entry appeared in the diary. He raised a family, built a life, died quietly in his sleep at the exact moment the book predicted. Perhaps being chosen isn't a curse. Perhaps it's simply a contract. Service in exchange for certainty. Devotion in exchange for belonging. I've started writing in the diary myself. My handwriting appears on blank pages at the back, though I don't remember putting pen to paper. I've added notes about the house's moods, about the way it seems to breathe around me now, about the comfort I've begun to feel when I hear my name whispered in the dark. The words aren't mine, but they come through my hand nonetheless. Last night, I walked to the basement door. I didn't go inside. I'm not ready yet. But I pressed my palm flat against the wet wood and felt something press back from the other side. Not a knock, not a push. A greeting. An acknowledgement. The same patient attention I've felt watching me since childhood, finally close enough to touch. My wife came to the house yesterday. I watched her from an upstairs window as she pounded on the front door, calling my name, her face twisted with worry and fear. A man was with her, her brother, I think, though his features seemed wrong from this distance, stretched and blurred like a photograph left too long in the sun. They walked around the property for an hour, peering through windows, trying locked doors. I stood very still in the shadows of the master bedroom and watched them give up and drive away. I could have let them in. I could have gone with them. But the house wouldn't have liked that, and I've learned by now that keeping the house happy is important. The walls are thin tonight, my grandfather wrote, and I finally understand what he meant. When the house is displeased, it shows me things. Glimpses through the thin places, visions of what waits beyond the membrane between this world and whatever world the house truly belongs to. I prefer not to see those things. I prefer the quiet companionship of the watching, the whispered name, the certainty of the date written in the diary. 1 month. 30 days until the date marked with that small symbol. I've stopped questioning whether the diary is real, whether the house is haunted, whether I've simply lost my mind in the isolation and grief of inheritance. Those questions don't matter anymore. What matters is that I've been chosen, just as my grandfather was chosen, just as all the names in the diary were chosen. The house provides, and the house requires, and I've made my peace with whatever that means. Tonight, I'll open the basement door. I think I'm ready now. Whatever lives down there has been calling to me with increasing urgency, and I've grown tired of making it wait. My grandfather saw it 30 years ago and wasn't afraid, and I want to believe I can be that brave. I want to believe that the 3 months the diary gave me are a gift. Time to prepare, time to understand, time to accept my place in the house's long history. But sometimes, in the moments just before sleep, I wonder if I ever really came to this house at all. I wonder if I'm still standing in the doorway with my single suitcase, breathing through my mouth, about to step across a threshold I can never uncross. I wonder if everything since then has been a dream the house is feeding me. A vision designed to make me willing, to transform my terror into surrender. I wonder if the date in the diary is a death or a birth or something else entirely, some third thing that has no name in any language I know. The whisper comes again. My name, spoken from everywhere and nowhere, patient and hungry and achingly familiar. I answer it now. I speak my name back into the darkness, and the darkness hums with satisfaction, and somewhere in the walls, something old and vast settles more comfortably around me. 1 month. I'm not afraid. I'm not sure I'm anything anymore.